and these are the only two studies that are currently published for this compound. There is a human serum epidemiology study that was published, and then a mouse dosing study. And so the summary of both of these, just to refresh your memory, is that in the human samples, PFMOA accumulates more than we expected based on its very low measure of absorption. It increases with age in humans, which is normal of a bioaccumulative compound. And the PFMOA that was measured in serum was not associated with any changes in liver or kidney function or lipid metabolism that this study investigated. The mouse dosing study found similarly no statistical differences in body, liver, lymphoid, or organ weights. And then there were some sex-specific differences in peroxisome proliferation, but they were not statistically significant. And as an overall conclusion, there is evidence in these two papers to support public health concerns for PFMOA, even with its very low bioaccumulation potential. We know that it does accumulate, and chronic environmental doses could still lead to adverse health outcomes. So there is rationale for developing a reference dose for this. There is just very little toxicity information to use. The previous discussion we had was that the two existing publications are well done, and they are not enough to derive a reference dose for PFMOA. There was some additional information the board sought, and so to respond to those concerns from the December meeting, there are no new publications to be considered. I've recently redone the search, and there's nothing additional, either by CAS number, by acronym, or by the full name of the compound. There are also no other non-regulatory protective values that we can derive without a reference dose. Pretty much every value we're going to use requires a reference dose. One of the board members suggested using a provisional peer-reviewed toxicity value, or a PPRTV. And these values are often used when there's not enough data to derive a reference dose, and they're used for remediation in the Superfund program at contaminated sites, rather than a specific health-based value. And so this is a worthy choice to look towards as we move into these compounds that have very little data. However, for PFMOA, there really is only one toxicology paper to use for this, and it has no effects data present. It presents no effects data. So there's no positive dose that elicits an effect in that publication. Same conclusion. Just to give a little more information about these provisional toxicity values, the EPA uses them. DEQ has never derived this kind of a number. And the EPA uses these when there is some useful toxicity data, but there's just not the quality or the quantity is not there. So if it's published in non-peer-reviewed sources like conference proceedings, there is large uncertainty factors. The study is not very comprehensive, or only a small number of animals was tested. They can also use an expert-driven read-across approach, which is just a computational method that is based on other chemicals in the same class. This program at EPA provides a real important source of toxicity information for their Superfund program and for remediation of these very contaminated sites. If we were to derive about a PPRTV for any of our PFAS, it would not be used like a reference dose. It would be used for remediation and screening. It cannot be used in place of a reference dose. Just a little bit more about this process. It is quite different than the derivation of a reference dose. It involves scoping and the needs of these different offices at the EPA, and so that would be analogous to the needs of the state and the departments. To develop a draft, you essentially do a literature review and derive a screening value based on the appropriate studies, followed by an internal review, an external review, a revision, and then a final assessment. It's much shorter and a more internal process. There's no public comment period or public draft that's presented with this kind of a value. The sticking point here, again, is that you need to identify the pertinent studies, and there really is only one toxicology paper for this particular compound published right now. And And so I think the question for the PPR-TV use is that if the board supports using a singular paper that presents no effects value, can you derive that value from that data, or is more data required? Yeah, that's the last one.
All right.
That was the only new information.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. Before we dive into the second revision of the summary of the board's work from July through the last couple of meetings on PFMOAA, I'm going to pause and see if there's any question on that refreshing of the topic from the macro scale of why focused on this compound, why focused on a reference dose, and then we'll revisit the topic of PFMOAA in particular. Are there any topics on that refreshing of any questions on the topic of why it is that we're here with this compound and a reference dose? I think it's important because I think what's going to flow from that is as soon as we close this one out, we'll move on to another one of those high priority compounds for which limited science might be available. David?
Bernie, thanks. Couple of interrelated questions. So the first one is, how is an RFD defined by the state of North Carolina? Do we use the same definition that EPA uses, or is it a different definition? Can you tell us that? Remind us of that.
It's the same definition and process, so it requires a lot of data to derive.
Well, it doesn't. So EPA chooses to use a lot of data. There's no legislative requirement within EPA that a lot of data is needed. So in developing an RFD, it's within an order of magnitude. So it's the same sort of language, right? So then that's one question. Then can we derive RFDs using EPA's protocol using a NOAEL only? And you can do that within EPA. They oftentimes use a NOAEL as a point of departure. So is the absence of a low AL in a tox study preclude development of an RFD, either for the state's policies on how to derive, because we don't have a state of North Carolina SOP on how to drive an RFD, correct?
I don't believe so.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. We talked about it previously in terms of it's not that there's not enough data, because like one well-crafted study, right, like we had for Gen X, we pretty much relied on, one well-crafted study to derive not just an RFD, but then the cascade of things that flow from it. Okay. It's just that these are not those. But your point is well taken in terms of, is there an SOP for how to do it? Not that I've seen. And in some of those regulations that cascade down from an RFD, in at least one of those, there was a data preference that if EPA has when you use that. Sure. If not, then you go to this, then you go to this, then you go to this. But the last line on there was the state could derive their own. Right.
But if we go back to the summary here, it says the studies are well done. So is the issue that we don't have faith in the NOAEL within an order of magnitude? I mean, that's really kind of key when we look at what an RFD is saying. Mm-hmm. It's saying you could be off by 10, really, an order of magnitude in either direction. So I mean, I'm just trying to make sure that from a derivation of an RFD procedural aspect, is this an open discussion really? Or is the procedure such that says we can't do it? And now it sounds like even if we were to derive a PPR-TV, which I've been involved with doing peer reviews of multiples of those, sounds like that's a value the state can't even use. So why go through the effort of creating that number when it's only for remediation but not health-based? So I guess it kind of comes back to, can the state of North Carolina derive an RFD from one well-done study that only has a NOAEL? I don't know that there's any legislative thing that says you can't do that. So if we were to apply standard uncertainty factors to a mouse study, 10, 10, pick whatever numbers, you'd probably get an RFD that's going to be qualitatively similar to Gen X and will probably be health protective, to the best of our knowledge now. And if additional studies come down the road, then you revise the RFD accordingly.
Yeah. My own take on it is, and we should get an answer, about what the state's SOP is, and then, like regulation-wise or written down-wise or policy-wise, because those are important in terms of your ability to diverge from them, and that the value of a science advisory board would be able to help thread that needle. That if given the flexibility as opposed to a prescriptive approach, then use the expertise that we can bring to bear to say, are the existing data adequate within the flexibilities that you have? I agree it's important. Another piece to this, though, and my own take on also with the one study would be, it would depend on a NOEL. I'd be comfortable depending on what the dose spacing was and other aspects of the study. And then also with regard to when are additional data expected. And in this case, we do expect a range finding guided study that's going to come back with more endpoints relatively soon. So for me, the answer would be, path forward would be knowing that answer to what the state's processes require or not, and the flexibilities that you have, because that will come up over and over and over again. If the answer was, yes, we have the flexibility to derive one based on a NOEL, would the board still think that was the appropriate approach with this study versus waiting a bit for the one that we hear is about to go to press with more endpoints?
I don't have an answer about using a NOEL.
Yeah, it'd be worth digging into if you don't know it now.
But the reality is the NOELs and tox studies are often the point of contention. Not unusual for the RFD methodology to rely on a NOEL for the actual, as opposed to a low AL.
How common is it the NOEL, the no observed effect level is used when it's unbounded by a low L, so that somebody doesn't know, hey, I'm backing down to a level and I can see the range of doses here.
Right. I mean, that, for a low toxicity compound, that may be all you have.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So again, that's where EPA oftentimes defers development. I mean, like when you think about the suite of chemicals that EPA develops RFCs and RFDs for, it's only a small subset that are pretty data rich. To tell you there's some that are still being argued for decades, right? That are data rich. So I'm not sure I would fall into the trap of saying EPA only does it for data rich compounds, because I'm not sure, again, there's a legislative requirement.
And we did it for a compound that wasn't really data rich, but it was a one well-crafted study with lots of QA, QC. Everybody could wrap their mind around it. And it was actually two. I think there was a rat and a mouse one, and maybe even a third. We had more points of departure to do the benchmark dose modeling with one. Yeah. I would probably try to capture in the notes from this, both getting an answer to that question, because it will cascade through all future meetings, as well as maybe thinking a little bit about the difference between a NOEL, an unbounded one with a low L right above it, so that we had the ability to say, well, we have a little bit of confidence too in its level of overprotection, because what will flow from it are decisions based on level of treatment, which are weighty. And the third piece, which is not a study in progress, but a study that's been conducted by a board member that's going to press.
Not to keep going, but I will. Part of the advantage of the low AL is it gives you confidence that you've got a test system that actually responds to the chemical of interest, and the investigator used outcomes that you can come back and say, well, they did pathology or they did organ weights. So the more robust the study is with respect to endpoints, you're more likely to find a low AL. So
Absolutely.
if it's not a very robust study, then I wouldn't call it well done for our purposes.
Yeah, and just to refresh people's memory on the well done, the DEQ's questions, charge questions were, are the studies of adequate quality, and then are they enough data? So maybe we didn't phrase that one as artfully as we could, but it was basically there's nothing that would make us throw it out. And if you recall with methyl bromide, we did throw out one where it was brought to our attention, a study that didn't have measured exposure concentrations, and folks wanted to know because the exposure durations were short-term and there might have been the want for acute number versus a chronic number that we provided. Study was brought to our attention and said, would this be an adequate foundation? And we said, no, based on data quality, no need to go further. So the language there about the studies were well done was a shorthand for saying we didn't have any reason to throw them out, like lack of measured exposure concentrations or some other QA/QC problem. Any other questions at a macro scale before we dive into the specifics on PFMOAA?
This is Elena. I had a couple of comments I wanted to make.
Okay, at the macro scale of framing the issue?
Yeah, that macro scale.
Good, thanks.
I think along the lines of thematic going forward in terms of derivation of health-based criteria, when you call it a reference dose, my underlying brain is thinking you're deriving, you have enough of the database to follow the kind of process in general that would be followed if EPA were deriving a reference dose. And that's simply because it's a very specific term that's broadly used and it has meaning. One thing I would like to know from the state is what do they want? Do they want an RFD like number that comes with those kinds of a certain level of body of evidence and process that's followed? On a personal level, I can say that I am comfortable if you have a single well-done study with comprehensive endpoints that demonstrate the dose response. Then if there's a strong need for a health-based criteria value, then I personally would not have a problem with developing one.
Yeah, I'm right with you there. And I think that, the state should respond to it in terms of if they have a perspective on it philosophically, but I think the example of Gen X was they did want an RFD with a high degree of rigor. But a single well-done registrant type study there provided that level of detail. In that case, it wasn't even peer reviewed. It was just of adequate quality once we all ran it through our own data quality sieves. But at the macro scale, it is a good question for the state to either answer now or talk about now or to revisit at a future meeting, because it will come up again when we talk about the robustness of data relative to the tool that it would be useful for the state.
Hey, Tom, this is Jamie. Would you like me to share any specifics about some of the data that will be in our upcoming, hopefully not too far away from going to press, PFMOAA paper?
Sure. Can I call on you for that in a second? Because I think there's an answer in the room or some perspective in the room on the larger issue of around what does an RFD look like for the state to be most useful and how much flexibility is there in deriving it. So can I put you on hold for a sec?
Oh, yeah, no problem.
Yeah, great. Thanks for being ready to do it, though. Chris had a perspective on RFD, and remember, Chris was the one who gave us the briefing on how an RFD would be used with a bioconcentration factor to derive surface water quality values that are protective of levels in fish that are safe for people.
Yeah, so good morning, everyone. This is Chris Ventolaro, Water Quality Standards, DEQ. So I can kind of give at least a perspective from a water quality standards perspective on the use of the reference dose. Our rules basically the rules that we use to develop water quality standards, which again are very specific things and have specific purposes, do require us to use reference doses, and that's pretty much all it says about it. Basically, the preference there is that we take them from published EPA documents, whether that's an EPA national recommended criteria or IRS risk assessment, and then the directors of DEQ, in consultation with the director of DHHS, can also select an RFD developed outside of those sources. So our rules are very specific about the use of an RFD. As far as I know, at least from the water quality standard side of things, we do not have any kind of SOP in place for developing RFDs because we typically don't do that. We rely on RFDs that are published in the literature by EPA, et cetera. It's not really a role that we usually take. That being said, if we had a question about an RFD-like value, we would most likely come to the SSAB and ask for the SSAB's opinion on the integrity of that value and the appropriateness of using that kind of in place of an RFD.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, Zach.
Just from a DHHS perspective, and we get involved when it comes to establishing a health goal, screening level. For drinking water, very similar. I don't think, and you all can correct me, that we have any sort of statutory language or administrative code language that spells out the sources of a reference dose specifically, but we do have a hierarchy of preferences that for what we use there. I was just pulling up to remind myself, but we are also not in the business of deriving reference doses. We did this with Gen X. That was the sole, well, maybe not the sole example, I guess.
It's the only example since I've been
Okay.
here.
Then it is the sole example. Sole example, which was obviously done, for urgent need, and then actually, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it led to the reconstitution of this board to be a sort of a sounding board and a external process for sort of approving and validating. But that's not, it's not something clearly that we would undertake unless there was a, sort of a clear and pressing need, given that this is not something that we are sort of staffed or in the business of doing, and also being very aware of the implications of such values. So I guess the short answer is not aware of any statutory or administrative code rules that spell out what can and can't be a reference dose, but we do have sort of our own internal hierarchy of how those are selected.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a super helpful discussion, and I appreciate Dave's question and people giving some initial feedback on it. It's important because if there isn't an SOP, it'll come up again for other high priority compounds. After we address PFMOA, there were other ones on the list that are detected in North Carolina. They're not on EPA's list to derive an RFD. State regulations are founded on RFDs, whether we're in the business of doing it or not. We'll have to get there. The lack of an SOP or any tight strictures would seem to be liberating for the Science Advisory Board. Then it's a mix of data quality and quantity. And I offered my own perspective that a single well-done study, maybe with a preference for a bounded low L with no L with a low L, be adequate, but there's a lot that goes into it. So would folks be okay if we left that issue for the day being some homework on just whether or not the initial feedback of, not aware of SOPs, strictures, hierarchies, other than internal. We export a little bit more and we report back as a foundation for when we do this again. It doesn't seem to inhibit our ability to move on to closing out PFMOAA based on the fact that we only have a couple of studies anyway.
I think we've heard what we need. I don't know that we need to assign homework.
Don't need any homework.
No, we don't need homework on that.
Then how about it be an awareness then instead of homework, that if you come up with anything different, let's revisit it. But the point being then that there isn't, like an 800 page SOP to borrow from that says this is exactly how we do it. If there was, you might not need a board. You just follow the cookbook. In the absence of the cookbook, maybe the board's more valuable in that regard to say the thoughts that go into that in terms of the quality and quantity of data are important. We can help folks through it without having a cookbook with the talent that's available in the room and reaching out to others. So good discussion on that. With that, I want to move us then on to the specifics of PFMOAA and see if we can draw that to closure. Draw it to closure in part because there's additional compounds on that list that Franny shared where an RFD isn't coming from EPA, and we have been tackling one since about July. I have received a lot of feedback, not just on reframing these issues, but also on trying not to wordcraft during these meetings. I hear you, but we owe a written response back to the state. We've provided 3 recordings of back and forth. Ultimately, a summary statement is necessary. So while I'm sensitive to both parts of that, we need to figure out a way to draw it to closure. I'm going to try to do that in 2 ways. To summarize what I think the big picture is of the comments so far, and then suggest that maybe we talk about in steps, like kind of a fatal flaw. Is there anything that you can't live with here that you think is wrong, as opposed to I've got a different word choice? And then maybe given some deference to a couple of people to close it out. The big picture that I've seen over the evolution of this from July until now, July when we got the charge, until now when we're working on the second revision, the big picture is that these 2 studies are the data. There was some uncertainty last time about, well, why wouldn't you use X, Y, or Z? And Franny has not just reiterated that the literature search was done last fall, but freshened it up with a new one. There aren't other PFMOAA papers to rely upon. I think another conclusion is that they are not adequate for an RFD based on the best professional judgment of the board members. There hasn't seemed to be any quibble about that. Another big picture that's in there is that we know that additional data are coming, and we can hear more about that from Jamie in a second, but that they sound like they would be particularly useful for this. And so, 4th conclusion, pause, wait for that additional data because it sounds like it'll be relevant for an RFD, and maybe don't go down a sidetrack of deriving values that don't have the regulatory utility that you think you needed when you framed the charge question to begin with. Those to me are the 4 big ticket items that we've agreed upon. But I'll open the floor to see if anybody would quibble with those before we get into how we're going to handle any particular changes in words. Does anybody else see any major difference in the overall conclusions than those? Doesn't sound like it in the room. How about on the phone?
Sounds like a reasonable move forward to me. This is Jamie.
This is Elena. I agree.
This is Gina. I also agree.
This is Rich. I agree.
Great. I guess what I had in mind for that's good progress. It's a clear statement that those 3 points or those 4 points are what we're trying to get out in a page of text. Technical details for which can be different by different folks. As far as the actual language goes, we have a couple of versions out there, the one I circulated and 2 that came back from folks with comments. Just wanted to open the floor and see if there was anything that, maybe it's too significant of a term, but I guess what I had in mind is there anything editorially that somebody says, I really want to see this change made because I think you're missing the point if you don't make it, as opposed to it might look better if you said it this way or be phrased different that way. And I find value in all of that. It just might be a better use of our time to say, this is like a fatal flaw in the language versus an editorial suggestion. So I'll stop talking and say, the version that's out there, is there anything that somebody really wants to call our attention to for a rephrase as opposed to a suggestion that we can follow up on? Great. We're making good progress. Then I would propose that it'd be appropriate to entertain a motion that we adopt the second revision conceptually with those big 4 summary points. And then I'll work with Franny on the 2 sets of edits that we received that were helpful suggestions on phrasing, but which do not change the intent of those 4 bottom lines. It'd be appropriate to entertain a motion to accept it as drafted as the near final draft. Then we'll work on final.
This is
However
Jamie.
you're comfortable with the path forward. Yeah, Jamie.
I make the motion.
I'll second it.
Any further discussion? No further discussion? Well, I have one, and mine is just to hear from Jamie on what because it might influence the way that we phrase the last sentence. What is the status of the PFMOA paper that you have in progress?
So I would like to say that it is almost to press, but we had to redo some of our data with respect to some of the urine concentrations. But just to let you all know that the paper will contain blood and serum concentrations in our experimental model. So that will hopefully give a little more depth to some of the data that are accompanying that. In terms of the adverse health outcomes that we evaluated, they are still the same outcomes that were published in the Woodliff et al. Paper. So we have liver weight, we have liver peroxisome proliferation, and then the antigen-specific antibody responses. And with respect to those 3 outcomes, we do see some alterations that are statistically significant. There are differences between males and females. And with respect to the antibody production, we see suppression in that response at our highest dose administered. In this case, it was 50 milligrams per kilogram. So if you recall from the Woodliff et al. Paper, the doses that we used for PFMOAA were very, very low. And that was because nobody had really published anything on any of the ether compounds before. So we had no idea how the test organisms were going to respond. We have since adjusted doses of the additional ether compounds up to usually 0.55 and 50 milligrams per kilogram. But for a few of the compounds, we've had to reduce those doses by a factor of 10. And in the case of a compound that we're testing currently, by a factor of 100 because of acute toxicity. But for the PFMOAA, we did see statistically significant changes in liver weight at 5 and 50 milligram per kilogram. So we have a NOEL as well as a LOEL for liver weight. Now we can have a whole conversation about liver weight changes. We did also see elevations in peroxisome proliferation in livers in male animals given 50 milligrams per kilogram. And then we saw suppression of the antibody response only in male animals at a statistically significant level at that 50 milligrams per kilogram. So those are the statistically significant changes that we observed, but in our paper we talk a little bit about some of the other changes that we believe are biologically meaningful and how this fits into the context of some of the other compounds, some of the other PFAS compounds. And our conclusion is that PFMOAA is producing the same suites of effects that we see for other PFAS in terms of effects on the liver and effects on antibody responses. And that's a quick summary. I'm happy to answer questions or give you more information if you would like.
Detlef has a question.
Thanks for the summary, Jamie. I'm curious, for Gen X, the point of departure that was used was related to liver lesions. Is that something you have looked at?
So we haven't done histopathology on the liver. We haven't traditionally done a lot of liver work in my lab. For some of the compounds, we've looked at lipid accumulation in the liver, but we're not pathologists, so we haven't looked for necrosis or apoptosis or the constellation of effects that were used in the Gen X assessment. However, we could potentially use liver weight. I think many people are aware of a study that came out of a group from the Netherlands not too long ago, looking at liver weight increases to derive relative potency factors. I believe that we discussed it at a previous board meeting. The same group also came out with a set of relative potency factors based on antibody suppression. So depending on the comfort level of the board, we could potentially move forward with a reference dose based on liver weight effects, with the assumption that those shifts in liver weight and shifts in liver peroxisome proliferation are likely to result in histopathological changes in the liver should the dosing had continued beyond the 30-day dosing period that we used.
You think that the liver lesions is a more sensitive response compared to liver weight or peroxisome proliferation?
So liver weight increases are, according to some, among the most sensitive outcomes of exposure to PFAS that also are associated with peroxisome proliferation. I think the debate within parts of the scientific community have been on whether or not liver weight changes alone are truly adverse. Some argue that they're adaptive responses because if you remove exposure, when you see only increases in liver weight, those liver weights return to weights of control organism liver weights. So the issue is duration of exposure. In some of the other rodent studies, the duration of exposure was more than 30 days. And as those liver weight continued to increase and the exposure continued, then the study authors observed histopathological changes in the liver. So we would have to make an assumption that should the PFMOAA dose had been delivered for a longer period of time, those liver weight increases would transition to histopathological changes. But to make my long answer short, liver weight increases are among the most sensitive endpoints for PFAS. But again, the debate has been whether or not those are markers of adversity or adaptive markers.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Any further discussion before I rephrase the motion and we vote on it? So So in case it helps, my take on the motion is that it's the motion to approve the draft text as conveying the major conclusions of the board, with a hand back to the chair, me, and the EQ's liaison, Franny, to handle the couple of versions of edits that we received, which do not affect those four major conclusions I outlined for you. All those in favor, say aye, please.
Aye.
4 ayes in the room, and how about on the phone?
Aye, Mr. Ridge.
Aye.
This is Jen.
This is Elena. Aye.
Great. Anyone opposed or abstaining? Well, thanks so much. That's a good discussion and good closure on a charge that we received from the state. We look forward to seeing the new data as they arrive for their adequacy for a reference dose, to get at the state's intent of having 4 values that could cascade there from state management, follow from data when we get to a database that's of adequate quality and quantity, as well as moving on to other high priority compounds. Because we revised the agenda, I think the next topic is I'm sorry, go ahead.
Before we move on, so maybe one thing for the state to consider in the meantime, before we meet again, is what role, if any, will read across have in derivation of an RFD? Because listening to what Jamie's describing, it'll be an important study. But again, I don't know that EPA would try to derive an RFD from that study, because it's not a broad set of endpoints. It's, there's no histopathology, et cetera. So we may be in a position, once that paper is available, to use both the paper plus read across to give some support for derivation of an RFD.
Yeah, I love that.
So, Jamie, what do you think? Or Elena, what do you think? That's my quick take, not having looked at your paper.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. This might be a good time too for me to just bring in something, and Tom, I apologize for shifting things around. At some point, it would be nice if we as a board could discuss the restriction proposal that was submitted by 5 member states to the European Chemicals Agency. And this would be a proposal to restrict all PFAS based on persistence and other toxicological types of effects. But this may be something that could shift whether or not the state wants to focus on individual PFAS or move to a broader approach, such as been recommended in the European Union.
That'd be a good discussion. I think that's a different topic than David was suggesting, though. David was suggesting that the state and us explore their comfort level with science-guided management, because it would still be science-guided for a read-across approach to bridge a data gap instead of having to have a study complete. And I do think along the lines of the SOP question, if there isn't an SOP that prohibits it, then it's more of a discussion about comfort level. And then it would be a good one to have.
Well, and I think this would be a similar discussion, because under the restriction proposal, there would be read across based on persistence across the entire class of PFAS. So this is sort of related to that topic, which is why I brought it up in response to David's comment.
Oh yeah, fair enough. I wasn't making the connection between read across persistence versus like read across toxicity that I might have been, or physiology that I might have been implying in David's question. But we can come at it for a couple of approaches. It's one of those things that's not a right or wrong. We had 6 different meetings with presentations on potential PFAS groupings that included group them all to group none. And we concluded that by saying that there was science-guided rationale for all of those approaches, but that ultimately, there's a management call there in terms of the level of rigor that folks want or precedent. I think it's a good topic, especially maybe the way that Dave asked it, anticipating getting maximum utility out of the pending data for a compound that's of high importance in North Carolina. And because it cleared something off the agenda, we'll have time. Yes,
I have a different thing I want to mention that's somewhat related, but not exactly.
Sure, and then let's move on so that we make sure that we give Kennedy his time before he has to hit the road.
So it's a question about the priority list that the state has, and I would like to maybe suggest that PFO5 DOA is added to that. After we reanalyzed some data for Wilmington, we saw that even though PFO5 was barely measurable in water, the blood levels in 2017, 2018 were 9 nanograms per mil, so that was actually the dominant PFAS in people at that time. So it's highly bioaccumulative. I think it's important to think about it because we do, and the facility is a source of that chemical, and I think we need to understand what the toxicity of it is.
I agree. The first 5 that we selected were just the 5 that were most concentrated in the surface water bodies. 04 and 05 were literally number 6 and 7. And the fish data mirrors what you just summarized. And so there are the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th PFAS on that list of top 5. There's no toxicity data for, so if we move through those pretty quickly. Onto the homologous series of PFO.
And so thank you. Then one other question I have is when I read through the PFMOAA summary from the board, it refers a lot also to the consent order studies that are upcoming. And I'm curious, who reviews the study design and the endpoints that are being evaluated in those studies before. It doesn't sound like they have started yet, right? But who's reviewing the study plans?
I am. And so we're the group of toxicologists at DEQ, which includes Chris and some of the other folks in the water sciences group. The aquatic toxicology branch has been really helpful in some of the tox protocols. I've also met with Jamie, Dr. DeWitt, and then also Dr. Sue Fenton at NTP about the 90-day rodent protocols. So any protocol that I have questions about, I do reach out to experts in this area, and they have been very kind to donate their time and expertise to helping us review them. The presentation I'm giving a little later kind of summarizes where we're at with a lot of those, but some of the range finding tests for the aquatic tox studies have started to come in. And so the 5 consent order compounds have all been tested as far as appropriate doses for algae so far. And so it is starting. The protocols have begun to be approved, and we're waiting on a few more pieces of information from Chemours for the Daphnia protocols to be approved. But that data is beginning to come in, and we're reviewing it to have a conversation with Chemours about appropriate dosing and things like that. And so I'm happy to talk with you about all of that if you like. I would love another set of eyes on the data as well.
And the reason why I'm asking is would the board be a resource? I'm not a toxicologist. But,
Well, I know Franny's reached out to individual board members on individual studies, but there's also the sensitivity to getting these things going.
Right, sure.
And the time that it takes the board to come to a root conclusion as opposed to a timely one.
Dr. Julia was of great help with the fish toxicity protocol.
hope the board is considered a resource along with the lines of my earlier comments. And I also think that the board can, constrain an answer to time allotted. The last one, I think, lingered a whole 2 months longer than it needed to based on a little bit of mission creep from the original charge question to some reframing of what the charge might have said. So a balance to be struck there. All right, thanks so much for the work on PFMOAA. We did rearrange the agenda to make sure that we heard from Kennedy Holt. It's a presentation summarizing the calls received and topics discussed by DHHS and the community around public engagement at the Commerce facility.
Hello everyone, I'm Kennedy Holt. I'm an environmental toxicologist with DHHS, and I know oftentimes in a lot of our meetings we go through, appropriately so, the science of all this stuff to help guide our decisions and everything. And what I want to take some time today is just provide, I guess, some of the human aspect of our work. And so what I'm going to go through here is the communications I have, and Michael Scott is aware of some of these as well, and folks at DEQ, because they also communicate directly with citizens, but kind of go through their perspective on things and how we communicate with them some of the nuances and honestly some of the struggles and issues we deal with some of this work, and kind of help them to make appropriate choices to move forward and help address some of the issues that they are dealing with. So at DHHS, our main role is to help people understand the concerns that they have related to health impacts related to PFAS exposure is what our main intention is, because DEQ has a lot of the role to helping with the consent order and going through the regulatory applications of the different rules that we have for PFAS. And so we take on the role of explaining those health impacts related to PFAS. However, that's not everything that we hear from the community. We also listen to various other concerns that they have, such as what's actually going on. I mean, a lot of this information, as we struggle to deal with it scientifically, they struggle just to understand what's happening in their community here. We also, again, kind of listen to all these various issues in terms from health impacts to legal impacts to economic impacts that they have here as well. And then upon hearing all these issues and trying to provide them some guidance and clarification, we also try to direct them to the resources that are available. So, I mean, both our agencies, DEQ and DHHS, have developed a lot of different resources to help explain this to people, but then there's also resources from external sources as well, such as community groups or other groups nationally that have also been developed as well. So try to point people to those resources that would be most appropriate for helping them. And so just kind of give an idea, and again, this is just from my end, this is not taking into account the calls I get from DEQ, but on a weekly basis, I get probably 10 to 20 different calls from people across the Lower Cape Fear region. And these conversations last anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour with each person in terms of following up with their questions and their concerns, and just kind of sometimes just through a natural state of conversation, just one thing leads to another, and going through all this and making sure that they understand and are able to take actions going forward, or at least becoming content is a really poor way of saying it, but basically they're at a point of understanding is really where I try to get people to by the time we're done finished talking. So we kind of go through some of the common themes and questions here that we get from folks. So like I said earlier, a lot of the community members really just, some of them are just becoming aware of this, and I know that seems kind of shocking, and initially it was to me too, but I mean, there's still people in this area that are just now learning that this is an issue in their community. And I know this summer to be 6 years since this hit the state stage, but I mean, a lot of the times I'm going through just the basic information of this issue here in terms of why is this happening, where did this come from? So explain to people the Comores facility and then their impacts and how the contamination got to Cape Fear River. So it's going through the different concerns, and people just think it's Gen X, but then when you start explaining that PFAS is a whole suite of compounds, and they're like, well, how many are there? Like 10? And it's just like, I wish. And you're kind of going through and kind of explaining the scope of this issue to folks. And when you start explaining, kind of getting to all this is where I said this conversation going for an hour when people are asking, well, when did it start? Just a couple of years ago? It's like, no. And it's just like, it's been going on for decades. And going through all this. So again, a lot of times we're going through and just providing this basic information to people just so they can understand the full scope of what's happening in their community. And oftentimes too, we are responding to people that have already received their results through testing, through the consent order, or if they've done private testing as well. But oftentimes when they get their results, that not all the PFAS are showing up in people's results. So a lot of times they're looking at the one that has the highest number, or the one that they may recognize typically as Gen X or PFOA or PFOS. But the common question is, how does this specific PFAS impact my family? And as we all know, for a couple compounds, we have information that we can kind of point to and be like, well, this is what we would be concerned about from exposure to Gen X or exposure to PFOA. But oftentimes, and again, we went through with PFMOA, this question is really almost impossible to answer, especially when we get to some of these other compounds as well, PEPA, PFO, 2HXA, all these other compounds that we're seeing now, beyond byproduct 2, all these other compounds that people are becoming aware of and seeing in different results. We really don't have great information to say how they're being impacted. And so what I typically often do is kind of frame it more generally as PFAS, and as Dr. DeWitt just mentioned the last thing is this whole question of classifying, looking at PFAS as a group of compounds or specific subclasses of PFAS is one of the things we can kind of potentially frame our guidance in, but also we point people to our clinician memo, which I know it's hard to see here, but this is just the front page of it here, where we took guidance that came out from the National Academies last fall that tried to put into context some serum levels measured with various PFAS, and then what those levels meant in terms of health impacts and how to communicate with your healthcare provider about these exposures and what to potentially incorporate into your routine care in terms of monitoring and looking forward as you go forward from these exposures. And again, like I said too, when people are getting these information packets or just learning about this whole situation, a lot of times people are just confused. They're struggling to understand what's going on. And I know there's been a lot of efforts between our agency, DEQ, and also the contractors and Comores themselves as well to try to provide better information to folks in the packets. But I mean, the packets people are getting, it's a lot of information to take in all at once. And it's really, people don't really know where to start with it a lot of times. So they're struggling to understand what actions can they take? What do the results mean? What does this mean? Are they to be getting water? Are they to be getting help? Are they not getting help? And so a lot of times I'm going through and explaining the role of the state and then also what actions the state is taking in terms of the development of the consent order, the implementation of the consent order, and also explaining that, because again, there's a lot of mistrust in the communities about Comores, and so when they're seeing contractors come up on behalf of Comores, really, oftentimes the community does not trust them. So explaining to them that the state is overseeing this whole process and it's signed off on this, and there is somebody else looking over it. This is not necessarily Comores by themselves coming out and trying to do these implementations. This has been something that's been approved by the state, and that these results are what is to drive any potential actions that will help people address this concern. And again, like I said earlier, just providing people the direction to these resources, because again, all of our websites, all the resources we put out there, not necessarily everybody knows about. I mean, again, these communities are sometimes, there are people that don't have internet. I still have people that ask me to mail them stuff or to everything else. And so we've established at DHHS, we established a community point, a public library down in the area to provide hard copies of these documents for people that maybe don't have access to internet or some of these other methods of communication that we kind of take for granted. But in these communities, that's something that I always ask and make sure when I'm pointing people to resources that they have access to these things. I've actually even texted people documents because that's the only thing they have is a cell phone that can receive text. So again, it's just trying to get people this information and trying to make sure that they understand the full scope of the issue that's going on here. And again, as I think as people are rightfully so, people are angry about the situation, again, as they're finding out about it, because again, this was nothing that they happened to through any fault of their own. So people are wondering who's responsible, who's to pay for this, who's to cover my medical issues, who's to help deal with my family's ongoing concerns. And so, and especially when we start explaining the full scope of potential health effects that can impact people, it really, not saying that PFAS doesn't have a potential role to play in those exposures, but it really, people start hearing all these different health effects and they start kind of putting two and two together. It's like, oh, well, I had this issue and you're saying this is a health effect of PFAS and I've been exposed to PFAS. So they think there's some liability there. So again, when I'm going through this, explaining about how Chemours is following the consent order and how it was derived, but then also, as part of this issue, especially when it starts getting into people asking about compensation or potential legal issues, that's really not something that we deal with. Again, we're not lawyers at DHHS. So one thing I make them aware of is that there have been ongoing lawsuits again for all this thing too, but I've also pointed towards community groups in the area. I mean, there are community groups such as Clean Cake Beer, Stop Gen X, where there are active community members and community leaders. And again, at previous board meetings, we've had Mr. Waters here several times come up here. There's community members that actively engage and point people to these community leaders that can maybe help them with some of those other issues. And I know some community groups as well, especially down in Wilmington area, help provide treatment systems and remediation for folks that were maybe not able to get those systems on their own. So I do try to point people to those outside groups. Because again, not saying we're not trying to help people out of state, but there are some things that we're just at this time not able to provide for folks. So I try to make them aware of additional resources as well to help them get what they need. So again, just kind of going, kind of stated some of this, I'll keep this brief, but again, in terms of guidance and recommendations that I try to point people towards is connecting them with DEQ resources. Again, a lot of times people that see the contractors or Chemours is kind of the face of coming out there. And I really try to put them in contact with our colleagues here at DEQ and let them know that DEQ is really helping kind of oversee this whole process. So oftentimes I direct them to waste management, Michael Scott, over here, and try to get people, it's like, if you have additional questions, like if you think something's not being done that should be done, reach out to DEQ and they can kind of look through your file if you're there, or kind of pull up your address and kind of help you get to where you need to go in terms of making sure what's being done is being done. And again, kind of going back to our additional materials here, pointing people to our website, our clinician memo. We've also developed a testing and treatment fact sheet because there are people in these communities that don't necessarily fall under the purview of the consent order. So we've developed materials to help people kind of do their own testing, do their own remediation if they so choose. So we've gone through called various labs across the region to get testing information for them. Can they test for PFAS, which PFAS, and incorporated that here, and then also gone through the literature and pulled in. It was actually Detlef's papers is what we pulled from for treatment and remediation to help incorporate that, and we actually got his input as well in developing those materials. So putting those together so that we can point people to treatment systems that are to remove PFAS, because unfortunately there are a lot of treatment folks that kind of take advantage of the situation and sell things that don't necessarily work to treat the problem that should be addressed. So we just want to make sure people have the right resources there. And then we're also pointing them to DEQ's website as well, because they've developed a suite of materials as well, in terms of helping explain the consent order and the various actions and the triggers for the consent order as well. And we've also, both our agencies have, for a lot of the materials, I'm translating to Spanish as well, because there are additional Spanish speakers in these communities as well. And so, and then kind of going back into the science here was the guidance and recommendations is, again, telling people that for really only 4 of the chemicals do we really have any hard information in terms of health advisory levels. And then kind of pulling back when people have concentrations of PFOA in their water and such, that kind of bring it back to PFAS generally, that PFAS as a group of compounds have been shown to have adverse health impacts, and that these specific health impacts are related to PFAS exposures. And just kind of put it generally, and again, not saying that I can't really put a level on it, like we can't Gen X or PFOA or PFOS, PFBS, but really just showing that there are concerns with exposure to these chemicals, and that if you are concerned about, talk to your healthcare provider, and again, kind of going tangentially with that clinician memo to help kind of how to frame those discussions with their healthcare provider. And that's really all I got here, is just kind of want to kind of bring that together, to just kind of put the human piece to all the information, the science that we're doing here. And I know we're all science driven in our decisions, and we should be. But again, this is something that, just as we're making these decisions and deliberating, if we're somewhere kind of on the fence here, it's just there are communities that are being impacted, and there are people that are awaiting our determinations and answers so that they can move forward and make the appropriate decisions. So that's what I want to share with you all today. So if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation, and thanks for the work to translate science to the public. And it's good customer service, and it's a hard job. I feel like, in some ways we're drowning in a sea of PFAS information from the websites to news stories. So good job spending some time on it. Are there questions from the board members here or on the phone?
No questions for me, and I'm here listening. I'm not off wandering the halls.
No questions, but I think it's great that you're providing also the resources online, like the website with the water filtration information and the clinician memo. I think all of those things are very helpful. I know it's challenging to reach everyone.
Yes, Rich?
Yeah, yes, I was wondering, I was going to ask, at the conclusion of these calls, does he generally feel that he's helped, did the people, it ends up being more of a positive outcome, or they're just left very confused and upset?
So at the end of my calls, I very much attempt not to leave people confused and upset. I try to at least have them on a path of taking action, whether or not they have a clear path forward in terms of, all right, if they don't qualify under the consent order, they've done something on their own, that they know what treatment system to look at in terms of helping identify whether it's, if their primary concern is drinking water, RO or GAC, if it's something where they are confused about the implementation or what they may receive based on the results of the consent order, I try to direct them again to DEQ, because even though I'm well aware of a lot of the consent order here, I don't want to speak or misrepresent, and DEQ is much more intimately familiar with that, so I try to steer them towards DEQ. I'm like, here's who to call and who's here to ask for, because again, a lot of times people express frustration that I guess whatever information you're getting in the packet, it's not straightforward for some folks in terms of answering, so they're just calling whatever number they can find on there. And I get a very frequent complaint I get is this: I call numbers and nobody ever calls back. And so instead of just saying, oh, call this number and they'll help you, I try to point them to exact people, and it really puts people at ease because they feel like they're actually reaching out to a specific point or place and not just a voicemail that's going to get abandoned forever and never be heard. And then also point to different resources, and I point to those resources and provide them a hard copy of something they can have. I also try to coach them through how to talk about these issues as well with the healthcare providers. This kind of instead of just saying, I got concerned, what are you to do for me? It's kind of helping them explain to them, it's like, maybe most time physicians are to be just as uneducated on this topic as you are. So kind of walking them through basic steps in awareness and kind of helping frame that conversation so they're just not outright dismissed, because that's, again, a concern and a complaint that I've heard from people that they've gone to their healthcare providers, and the healthcare providers is like, I don't know what you're talking about, and this moves on. So just kind of, I try to provide at least next steps for folks, and sometimes I hear back from folks and follow up. Sometimes I don't, but I try my best not to leave people in a more confused state than when they called.
Thanks for the question, Rich, and presentation, Kennedy. Are there any other questions or comments from board members? I think, one aspect of proficiency in any field is the ability to demystify complex topics and direct people to appropriate resources. There is a lot of complexity, but we ought to be able to speak about it in plain language for the public we serve. So good job. Thanks for the presentation.
Thank y'all.
Yeah, thank you. I think that brings us, am I right, Franny, to our break for lunch. We will return at 1 o'clock and take up the PFOA, PFOS bioaccumulation factor evaluation. Wrap up that topic and then move into a couple of presentations. So we'll regroup at 1. All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. I'm going to call us back to order for the second half of the meeting today. Remember that we voted this morning to switch a couple of topics. So we are now at revisiting maybe wrapping up the discussion on PFOS and PFOA bioaccumulation factors. I had said before that I'd try to do a better job of working with Franny to reframe what the topic is, given the passage of a couple of months. And I'll give you my perspective on where we are at a macro scale, and then Franny's got some slides to reframe us. We were given 3 charge questions that Franny will share with you a couple of months ago. And they had to do with the state's want for a surface water concentration of PFOA and PFOS that would be protective of people consuming the fish that were in those waters. So the goal is a surface water concentration that would be protective of human health for those people that are eating fish grown in those waters. To do that, the state needs a reference dose, which will, in this case, of PFOA and PFOS, be available from EPA. Those are some of the focal compounds for which EPA is engaged in, and it has data and plans to continue to work on those. But you also need a bioaccumulation factor. So that's the macro scale where the state came back and had 3 focused questions on their proposed path forward for a bioaccumulation factor to fit into state water quality standards system to end up with a surface water concentration for these compounds. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Franny to go into a little bit more depth on where we've been. My perspective is we've already answered the first couple of the charge questions. When we get to those, if Franny hasn't summarized them, I'll recapture where I think we are. At the last meeting, the board asked to see the data in a slightly different way. the state had proposed a truncated data set to exclude some species, representative species that aren't known to occur in North Carolina. And several folks on the board thought that, a wealth of data may show that fish are fish, and not a good reason to exclude things. Let's see the data that way. And that's what we distributed a few weeks ago for people to have a look at. So I'm going to turn it over to Franny for a little bit more on teeing up the background before we start charging ahead.
All right, so I'm going to go through just a brief summary of this larger, more comprehensive presentation that Chris Ventolaro gave in the October meeting. And so the link to that longer presentation is here and will be posted for you to reference if you desire. So in terms of why we're doing this, and Tom summarized this really well, surface water standards are designed to protect a variety of surface water uses, including the consumption of fish tissue, and then protection of specified waters for use as public water supplies. Our surface water standards are established from the published EPA Clean Water Act, other EPA regulatory values, and then our calculated values based on our North Carolina specific rules, and for this one it is 2B 0208, the narrative standard for toxic substances. Bioaccumulation factors are a big part of our surface water standards, particularly for the protection of those consuming fish from these water bodies. This is an estimate of accumulation in fish tissues from exposure with water and food. And this is determined by just comparing the concentration of a contaminant in the fish tissue by the concentration of the contaminant in the water column. And it is just the derivation of a factor, and it's part of the equation we use to derive our surface water standard. So the equation in the middle is the bioaccumulation factor equation, which is just iota over water. And then we use these to develop our standards, and the two equations in the middle are where the BAFs are plugged in. But these BAFs are used to determine the water column concentrations, that if these concentrations are met, it prevents the accumulation of a substance in a fish tissue to a level that is potentially harmful to people. And so it's kind of using this accumulation in fish to back calculate what the water concentration would be to prevent that kind of accumulation. And so these are the equations for the fish tissue standard and then also the water supply standard. The BAF sources that we used in the previous and the current analysis were the bioaccumulation information published in the EPA's draft aquatic life criteria for both PFAS and PFOA. Links are here, the one that we posted. Previously, we did North Carolina specific evaluation of these bioaccumulation factors. So we narrowed this down to North Carolina resident fish species and shellfish species that are related to species in North Carolina, those that are commonly consumed. We focused on muscle tissue for the fish and then whole body concentrations for the shellfish. During the December meeting, the board requested that all species from the EPA draft aquatic life criteria be included in the calculations for comparison. And that was due to there being 200 species of fish in North Carolina, and our specific analysis is only going to include 14, but then to limit the bioaccumulation calculations to just those specific species that match North Carolina does leave a significant number of species unrepresented. So here it is. There's a lot in this table, and so I'll orient you. The blue rows are for PFAS, and so they're separated by group. We have the North Carolina specific fish mussel, and then the North Carolina specific fish and shellfish bioaccumulation factors together, followed by the all fish, which is all of the species that were presented in the EPA documents, and then all fish and shellfish. So those are separated by bold and italic to give you some kind of visual separation. And the same is true for PFOA, which is the lighter green color. Just to summarize the differences in these data sets, when all fish and all shellfish were included, the min and max bioaccumulation factor changed a lot. The range got a lot wider. But the geometric mean and median stayed pretty close to what it was when only the North Carolina species were included. And of course, the average or the arithmetic mean went up because the range got a lot larger. For PFOA, the same is true of the range, so it went an order of magnitude lower. And the maximum was the same for the North Carolina fish and shellfish. They were what was included before. And then the geometric mean varied a bit, as well as the median, but it didn't change all that much. Just a few times difference, not an order of magnitude. And so this was the way that this data was requested to be presented, so you could easily see the differences between those that were specific to North Carolina and then everything that we had presented in the EPA documents. And the last slide is just the request that we made to the Science Advisory Board previously. And so the first question was, does the SAB support the use of the EPA literature for a derivation of a bioaccumulation factor for North Carolina? The second was that is the method that DEQ applied to the EPA's vetted bioaccumulation data scientifically sound, and that was the North Carolina specific filtering. And then the third is which statistical value is most appropriate. So the arithmetic mean, geometric mean, average, median, or some other statistic to represent these bioaccumulation factors for North Carolina. So I'll go back to the table for you to look at. Those are all of the slides that I have.
Thank you, Franny. Before we jump into the charge questions and resume the discussion from last time, is there any questions about the refresh of the topic that we just gave? Any questions somebody has about why we're doing this or the final intent?
Maybe a technical question?
Sure.
So you've got really wide ranges across fish or shellfish. Do you have confidence that some of your lower or upper values are not just outliers, either analytical outliers or other types of outliers? Like, do you have a sense of that? 'Cause it looks like you're just including all the data to calculate your mean, average, and medians, right?
Yes, and so these values were all published in the EPA documents, so I didn't look at them for outliers. These were all concentrations and bioaccumulation factors that met either medium or high quality criteria by the EPA. And so I just included all that was present, or all consumable species. There were a few like goldfish and a few others that are not consumed that I didn't.
So EPA's data synthesis exists in a draft PFOA and a draft PFOS criteria document. And then there's a paper that came out of it just focused on the BAF derivation. And these were BAFs derived for a different purpose. They were derived for the purposes of trying to figure out a water column concentration that would be, or a fish tissue concentration that would be protective of aquatic life. So it's the same database, but used for a different purpose. And they went through, after gathering all the data they could find globally, a data quality sieve looking for things like outliers. And then with the remaining data, they grouped them into high, medium, and low quality data based on utility. And they had 4 factors: the number of water samples that were used to derive the BAF in that data set, the number of fish tissue samples, the temporal relationship between the locations, the closer the water and the fish data were collected to each other at a particular spot, the better, high, medium, and low. And then the same thing with regard to spatial coordination, how close were the water and fish samples taken. So they sorted things into bins 2 different ways. First was data quality, like integrity, yes or no, and then data quality in terms of utility, high, medium, and low. And the state's proposing to only use the data that EPA deemed to have fallen into the medium and high category. So that level of sorting is kind of pre-baked in to what the state used to show this. They didn't do that independently, but relied upon something that was recent and well explained.
Tom.
Yes, sir.
I have just a question in general. looking at this table across the board, PFOS, BAF is much, much larger than before. What's the reason for it?
It just seems to
Everything-
bioaccumulate a lot more.
Yeah,
Everything I've seen in whatever literature is just basically shown that PFOS tended to bioaccumulate more than PFOA. You know, I haven't, that I can recall, I don't recall seeing anything that really tried to explain why or had information to show why. But I don't know if some other folks may have that information. I don't know.
this is the pattern that is prevalent in the literature in wildlife. I think, and Virginia, you might know better than I do, but I think it is slightly different in humans. PFOA accumulates, maybe not at the same rate, but perhaps more comparable. But PFAS is almost always more accumulative based on the data that I've seen. I don't know why. Sorry. I don't have the answers.
That's fine. Just, if I could just narrow it down, are the total concentration of PFOS, are they similar to PFOA in aquatic systems, or are they substantially larger?
Yeah, so I can tell you the fish data that I've collected and analyzed myself, that PFAS is a higher concentration and more prevalent across the board than PFOA is, both.
But that's in the fish. That's in the fish. I'm talking about in the water itself.
I'm talking about the water as well.
I'm sorry, please, okay.
Yes. So in the Cape Fear data that I'll show, I guess next, PFOA is detected in the water. PFAS is detected in much greater concentrations.
Okay.
And then in the fish, PFAS is detected across the board in all of them. And PFOA is detected in few.
Thank you.
Maybe a couple comments. I was just reading a little bit also and it looks like trophic level makes a difference in what the bioaccumulation factor is. And it's like some states might have used also the 90th percentile rather than a mean or median. So I'm curious, I think Minnesota and Michigan have gone through this exercise. You know what the values are that for PFOS and PFOA?
Offhand, I don't know what summary statistic they used. I can tell you that the geometric means presented here match fairly closely with the data that I have from the Cape Fear River. I know, there have been, I think at least one state used the percentile, which we talked about in December, but I didn't present it here just because it wasn't presented before.
At the December meeting, we talked about the fact that in addition to these summary statistics, you could use a different percentile approach, or relative to the guidance early on in our charter about presenting things as a range of risk. Look at the sensitivity of this across a range of values. And again, the EPA did the synthesis for a different purpose in the PFOA and PFOS criteria documents, but they used the 20th percentile of the ranked values. So I think the thing that is in common is nobody's focused on the extremes, but some place where there's more data around the middle of a distribution.
I would think trophic level might be relevant here in terms of what people might catch and eat. And I think that should be considered, whether, maybe some of the lower values are for lower trophic level that isn't relevant for human consumption.
So the way we filtered the data, even inclusive of all, those species that are not consumed, minnow was one of them, goldfish, like very small fish that humans wouldn't eat, and then also a species of eel was included. Those were not included in this table, so we filtered it for things that we know people consume regularly. But you're right, the trophic position is important.
So with the general discussion, not going to cut it off. If there's more general questions, please bring them up. But let's head back to those 3 charge questions, and we'll probably end up at your table. But in the interest of trying to make progress so that we could end with a document like we did with PFMOAA, which could be drafted by Franny with help from Chris and me, as long as we're on the same page for general direction. At the last meeting, it sounded like to me that the answer for number 1 was a pretty clear yes, that the SAB supported the use of EPA's recent literature synthesis as guided by those 5 data quality steps that I mentioned as a foundation. There's a couple of people with us today that weren't here in December, so I'll stop there for just a second and see if there's any more discussion on number 1, or if folks are generally comfortable that the answer to that is yes, the SAB does support the use of the literature as a foundation.
So maybe a comment. I mean, the state put in a lot of effort to do its own evaluation of fish and shellfish in North Carolina. And if I look at that table, that appears to be not as subject to the extremes that the EPA data has. So I guess I haven't heard a clear rationale as to why we would not favor data generated by DEQ within the state of North Carolina as opposed to using the EPA. That's maybe a supporting document as opposed to a primary.
I can answer that. And so I'll go back to this table just, when I went through this quickly, I probably just wasn't clear. The North Carolina fish, mussel, and fish plus shellfish are from the EPA document. And so this original appendix was filtered for species that are either present in or analogous to North Carolina species.
So that doesn't reflect the actual biomonitoring data that you've been accumulating over the last. Got it. Okay.
This is just EPA data.
As Rosanna Dana would say. Never mind.
Yeah. But you're right. So we have spent a lot of time and effort analyzing North Carolina generated data. And it is downstream from the source of contamination. And so it's worth discussing whether or not that is applicable or representative of the entire state or not. An interesting data set that I'm excited to share with you, but this is just EPA data on this table.
Okay.
And the state is going to try to, use this to derive numbers for those 2 chemicals for the state's waters, as opposed to a site-specific standard. And site-specific standards are always an option. But the goal here was for a number statewide. And so everything on there is EPA's data set. It's just EPA's data set completely, where it says all, or it's EPA's data set truncated to include those taxa which are known to occur in North Carolina if it wanted to be a little bit more focused. And so it dropped out things internationally that don't occur here. And that'll be relevant to question number 2, because under question number 2 is where in December there was some suggestion that maybe the step of truncating the data set isn't necessary when you're data poor. Once you've been through a data quality sieve, you're trying to get a reflection of aquatic life in general and maybe not throw out all the rest of the data. People at least wanted to see the 2 data sets side by side. But circling back to number 1 before we get to number 2, for me that question basically is EPA has done a recent literature search and a recent data quality sieve that ended in a peer-reviewed publication, and the state's using that as a starting off point. And we had said yes last time. Has anybody got a different opinion or more granularity on that issue this time? Anybody online?
I'm fine with it.
Okay.
Can I make a motion that we support it and then just get to a
Keep on
formal?
going? Sure. Dave makes a motion that we have the answer be yes to number 1. I guess that will make it easier to have to write it up later. Is there a second?
Second.
Second, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Elena? She had to step away. Anyone opposed? Count. 1, 2. Yep, that's half of us. That'll work. All right, making good progress. The second question had to do with, is the method that they applied to EPA's QA/QC sorted data qualified BAFs scientifically sound for North Carolina's BAFs? And we said last time, yes, it is a scientifically sound approach. And the only thing that was asked for there is perhaps a look at not parsing the data, but include the entire data set, which is what EPA did. Again, for a different use of the data, in their case, a nationwide number. But their rationale being that once you've been through the data quality sieve, you're just trying to get a representative sample of aquatic life in general, maybe not focused on any particular geography or underlying conditions. So any more feedback on that one or different perspective on the qualified yes from last time?
I guess I have a question, and since I'm not familiar with the methodologies really, but it looks like Michigan used stratified trophic level 3 and trophic level 4 data to come up with then a water quality value, and Florida actually stratified it to trophic levels 2, 3, and 4, come up with a value, and I just don't know enough about how this stratification helped, or is that useful to come up with a better value than using just all data in one swoop?
So I can say based on the data that I've analyzed from the Cape Fear River is that trophic level plays a role, but it's not a clear relationship with PFAS or any of the PFAS that we analyzed for. And so I believe in the appendix the trophic level was listed, and so we could sort it out that way and see how they would change. But based on the data that I have, I don't know that it would be a clear relationship. And so I see why Florida used 2, 3, and 4, because they're probably not that statistically different.
And Florida, they use 937 for number 2 and almost 3,000 for 3 and 6,000 for trophic level 4. So pretty big differences.
Yeah, those are large differences, and that was for PFOS.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, and it certainly makes a difference on the concentration of the fish versus the water, and how that the ratio or the equation will turn out.
I just don't know whether it's important.
Yeah, I wonder how that is. How would that be applied? Like, would the person eating or catching the fish need to know what trophic level they are?
Yes, they would have to know. Basically,
like, how is that translated?
Yeah, basically, it kind of modifies the equation a little bit. The equation that we use to calculate the standard for the accumulation factor component, typically they would basically be kind of like this. I'm trying to remember the costs of it. It kind of has like a component that add the different bioaccumulation factors together, and it's factored into dividing the denominator. I think usually when EPA does it that way, they also consider different fish consumption rates that are tied with each of those trophic levels as well, which is something that we would also have to. So it's kind of a relationship, kind of trying to estimate, how much of each of those trophic levels would people typically eat and consume. So we would have to look into that, since we don't have the way our rules are written. It's just very kind of straightforward. The fish consumption rate is 17.5 grams per day, and that's it. If we were to go down the path of using accumulation factor split up by trophic level, I probably want to converse with EPA a little bit and see what kind of guidance they have on does that need to be associated with a separated fish consumption rate as well. I probably just have to look into it. Short answer. But there is a way to do it.
Yeah, I just, yeah, like I say, I'm not an
it's interesting.
expert in this, and I don't know whether that approach leads to, more. And then just,
Sounds like it would.
Yeah.
Well, I think it would depend on how you did the next step. It would provide a foundation for making one that was more conservative if then you knew that you were going to drive it toward assuming that people consume only that kind of fish, like the worst case scenario, or that you had some way to say we're going to more heavily weight that type of fish that has the higher accumulation factors and put lower weight on other trophic levels. So it would provide a foundation for a different way to look at it. Depending on what assumption you use there, it could still result in an averaging across species.
And I think one of the things that when we parsed the data to begin with, one of the things that we also looked at was we weren't just looking at which species are similar to species in North Carolina. We were also considering which species are typically consumed. So we tried to, we didn't go to that extent of looking at the different trophic levels and consumption rates, but we did try to at least factor out, like, okay, we can verify that these are the typically consumed species. So it was, the NC specific numbers were kind of geared towards that purpose, if that helps.
The Burkhardt paper talks about other things that seem to influence, the stretch of the data, and they talked about that there being a relationship between the amount of PFAS and PFOA in the water. I forgot which direction that was. It might have been lower values tended to have higher bioaccumulation factors. So there's one of the values of using field data is a lot of that variability site to site for other controlling factors. Maybe a couple that we understand and some that we don't understand yet are baked into the data. I don't recall the Burkhead paper, but I haven't read it in a while, making a big deal out of trophic level as a way to sort the data.
just grouped it all into one, I think.
Well, it was more an examination of what might explain the variability, and I don't recall them coming up with that.
Came up, I think, with one average value.
And I might be, reading it too specifically, but I give deference to the agencies. When I see number 2 that says, is their approach a scientifically sound approach? I think it's okay to place emphasis on that A. And, if we think that is yes or no, and then if you have other ways that you'd like them to explore, provide that as well. And not meaning to put my thumb on the scales or anything, because if you clearly think there's a better approach, then we should get into that. If you think that there's other approaches and this one is unsound, we should be clear that it's not sound. But if it is sound and then there's other approaches, I still think that would be progress as well. The board's gotten things where we've been asked to derive something from whole cloth, like Gen X, and we've gotten things like methyl bromide, which was staff brought us a number and said, is this one sound? I think the questions are fair. So it might not. I guess I'm saying in a long way that number 2 could be answered of a specific answer to the state's approach, and then some feedback on other ways that you might do it.
I think the trophic position component is an interesting one, and it might be more clear in the EPA's data set, the different trophic positions, and when I made the comment about it being statistically different, I was thinking about the Cape Fear data, and there's, you know, 2 species that have very clear trophic positions, and then all of the other ones kind of are omnivores across all potential food sources. So it's a little more difficult to parse out their trophic position. But I think it is interesting, and I will look into it because I'm curious now.
Anything else on number 2?
So just for clarification, the scientifically sound approach involves vetting the data to only look at data that meets a certain quality, and then picking from the EPA data set species that would be representative of fish and shellfish found in North Carolina.
One more piece, commonly consumed in North Carolina, so that you drop out the minnows that might have been native to North Carolina.
So that's really the question at hand. It's like for the larger EPA data set, you applied those 3 sieves and came up with the final, and the question is that scientifically sound? Right?
That's correct.
So I think so when we write this up for the motion, and I'll make a motion that we just, include those 3 factors so that it's explicit as far as what we're voting on, right? As opposed to, because 2 and 3 are actually tied together. And so what I would say is that 2 is just strictly how do they basically truncate the data. So I'll make a motion that says yes.
Be a motion that says that the state's approach of relying upon EPA data truncated to include those species commonly consumed in North Carolina that met medium and high data quality.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Is there a second on that?
Second that.
And then I'll open it for any further discussion. The motion on the floor is that the board's feedback to question number 2 is yes, but that it's phrased of it's yes that the state's approach of using EPA's data set that met high and medium data quality objectives said to include the data from species commonly occurring in North Carolina which are commonly consumed, is scientifically sound. Is a scientifically sound approach. It's an important one. Any discussion? How are folks on the phone feeling about it?
I'm fine with it.
Then I think we can move it to a vote. All in favor, say aye. 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 I heard an aye from Rich, Elena, and been joined by David. Welcome.
Yes, apologies for being late. I vote aye.
And Elena, have you been able to hear us or be heard? And any opposed or abstaining? Great. Well, welcome, David. We appreciate you joining. David changed jobs from Health Director of New Hanover County to Health Director of Brunswick County, and today was like a first staff meeting in his new capacity. So I hope that went well this morning, and I appreciate you joining this afternoon.
Thank you, Tom.
And thanks for continuing to serve on the board in the new capacity. Anything else we wanted to add for Franny, Chris, and me for a writing team to draft this up in the discussion of number 2? Capture the trophic level idea, and Franny's mentioned that they'll explore that a bit. Great. Well, then that moves us on to number 3, which is which value is the most appropriate, the average, geomean, median, or some other statistic to represent EAS for North Carolina. We've had a little bit of discussion on it. variety of opinions last time, from the mean captures the range of the data better to geomean is better for something that's intended to be used as an average over a lifetime of exposure. And we did mention last time that it could be a range of values from like a median for your average fish consumer to a upper 90th percentile or something for people that, you know, may be more heavily reliant upon fish. Noting that other aspects of the state equations, you know, don't have that variability. They can say that they include like a certain amount of fish consumed and a certain body weight. But I'll open the floor for discussion on this one. We didn't come to any conclusions last time, to paraphrase.
So can the board seek advice from a statistician? I mean, I think if you talk to most statisticians, they would tell you that, you know, with things as variable as that, like looking from 9 to 50,000, that the average may not be the most appropriate, that there's more stability for both the geometric mean and the median, which on eyeball appears to be true. But that might be worth just getting an opinion from a statistician.
I think another consideration though is how protective you want to be. I mean, if you want to be, say, more than averagely protective, you might do a percentile. I think Detlef mentioned some state that said something to 90th percentile or something like that. You know, so I would think if I wouldn't necessarily use a measure of central tendency, but some percentile that would be more protective, would be worth considering.
It's interesting because, you know, at the meeting last time, the additional 4 lines on this slide had to do with a recommendation to examine the influence of including all of the data versus a subset of the data. And we learned that the measures of central tendency aren't influenced much. So that was good. But it might be worth, examining what's the influence of a median to 90th percentile value. How would that influence the derivation if the goal was in fact to be protective and include the fact that, you know, some people are more reliant upon fish than the average consumer? And I guess I'd also mention that, you know, our charter says to the extent that we can advise EMC and others on a range of risks that we should. So that would be a data-driven range of bioaccumulation factors. And maybe encourage people to look at a data-driven range of body weights or a data-driven range of fish consumption behaviors.
Tom, this is David on the line. Practically speaking, for community members, some who partake daily versus some who once a year may partake from fish from surface water, the impacted surface water, I can certainly support from the community risk standpoint, as was mentioned, to the degree feasible, informing the public applicable to their consumption pattern, which you mentioned earlier, something along those lines, so that it's not the advisor's not washed out so much with just one figure that they're not really able to digest what they should be doing in terms of their behavior and consumption. If that makes sense.
It does. Seems like that could be part of a derivation that leads to more information for decision makers to look at, and it could also be part of a communication strategy for whatever comes out in terms of putting final numbers into context.
That's correct, yes.
I think it's important to remember that for this purpose, the VAF would be used in part of an equation for a surface water standard. This is not for a fish consumption advisory. Our surface water standards are designed to include a bioaccumulation factor, so the water is at a concentration that leads the fish to be consumable. This is not the equation for a fish consumption advisory. This is just for water to lead fish to be okay to consume. Just
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah, so the approaches that I was mentioning earlier were all in relation to a water quality standard. Minnesota used the 90th percentile and actually weighted higher trophic level species, so it's probably the most conservative approach. They ended up with a value of 7,210 for PFOS, so that's actually close to the max for the NC fish muscle. I think I like the idea of presenting multiple values to evaluate what this also translates into, and I think in the end, the idea is to protect people who are also heavily, are subsistence fishers, people who are routinely eating fish and get exposed to these levels of PFAS.
So am I hearing some convergence around the idea that examine or include looks at the median and 90th percentile as a range for average, no reason to go lower, and high end of bioaccumulation.
Honestly, the challenge is you can pick any number you want. If you go 95th, you could say maximum for North Carolina. I mean,
Sure.
there's no, all numbers could be defended and none of them could be defended, so to speak.
Part about the A sound approach versus the sound approach.
Right. What I would question is the third charge is, can we request a different charge as opposed to most appropriate? Maybe the question is most health protective. Now that makes it easier for us to give advice back to the state with respect to selection of a value that might be more health protective. And that goes back to, Richard, your comment about, I mean, the way it's written now, it's almost more of a statistics question as far as what's the most appropriate statistic. That's a statistics question versus what's maybe the most appropriate with respect to food consumption, health protection, things like that.
it is a statistics question.
What?
It is a statistics question. So it's which type of number. The numbers itself are they're presented in a table, but it's really which of these values is most appropriate based on their mathematical derivation.
Right.
Not what would be more health or less health protective, because where appropriate, we're going to use our own fish data, and where appropriate, we'll use these. But it's the mathematical derivation that is the question.
But what we're discussing is honestly not a statistical question. It's not. I mean, saying 95th percentile is what Minnesota did, or that's again, those are not necessarily driven by statistics per se, as much as consideration of health as well.
The most health protective value, I think, is where the highest one.
Yeah.
So
I think for the sake of comparison, I think what EPA typically does is use a geometric mean when they're coming up with bioaccumulation factors for their national recommended criteria for this purpose. And that's kind of, to me, that's kind of like the baseline. That's where I would default to, because it's once you start getting into what's more protective, what's less protective, you're starting to get to the questions of kind of risk management. And our rules are kind of designed to have a certain degree to kind of define that in a sense. We don't define exactly what type of BAF to use because we rely on EPA's BAFs, which are typically done as geometric means. That being said, the other components of that calculation do make some decisions that kind of are geared towards that. So like I think the drinking water intake is maybe the 90th percentile of all of the national health data from CDC. The fish consumption rate was similar. I can't remember if it was 90th, 95th percentile. So that's kind of already assuming that you're looking at the higher end of fish consumption out there. So some of that's built into that equation already. And now what we're kind of looking for with the BAF typically is what's really kind of the best way to represent all of that information that's out there in a kind of want to say an unbiased way in a sense.
Well,
I
and
don't know if that makes sense.
relative to I would say, also relative to the nature of the toxicant and the the duration of exposure. In this case, it's intended to be protective overall. And so it's not like it's an acute toxicant where you might need to default to the extreme values because it's not like it's a short-term exposure. So I think probably more towards central tendency, but I could see why we might encourage a range of values up to something like a 90th percentile. I think people are been pretty clear that picking the extremes of a range probably aren't that helpful. That would tend to devalue any of the other data in the entire data set by just picking extreme value or the other. And I think, part of the encouragement could be this is one factor in an equation that includes body weight, fish consumption and rate, and
Reference dose.
and the reference dose, and those are all important variables too. And if we're charged to try to make advice on across a range of risks, you might need to look at a range for all of those values. And look at that. Yeah, Chris.
Sorry. The other thing to keep in mind too is that I think, if I'm not mistaken, I love that the Minnesota number may have been kind of a site-specific. Like they were looking at one particular water body that they derived standard surface water standard for, and that's something else to consider. If we were to do site-specific standard, kind of site-specific versus statewide. Like in the Cape Fear, we know there's a definite exposure, there's a definite risk there, so maybe a different number would be applicable as compared to statewide, where there maybe isn't that same type of exposure or the same type of risk. But something else to just kind of throw out there.
Yeah. So statewide, assuming a lifetime of exposure. Toxicity type of concern than a toxicity concern. Does any of that help firm it up enough in somebody's mind to as a path forward or drawing it to closure? More questions?
So I'll make a motion,
All right, let's hear it.
which is not tied to question 3, but it is. And that the SAB supports the use of the EPA approach of using a geometric mean to represent PFOA and PFOS BAFs for North Carolina is appropriate, something along those lines.
Okay.
And then defer back to what the normal way that EPA handles it. And that seems similar to number 1. I mean, we're using EPA data, we're using EPA. It seems to me that the geometric mean, like I said before, is it's probably a more stable estimate than compared to the average for this data set that ranges so widely. And but instead tie it back to EPA's approach. And that we would endorse the application of EPA's approach for deriving a EAF value from the bill.
All right, we have that as a motion. Thank you, Dave. Is there a second? Then we can move in discussion if there is.
Seconded, so we can.
Left second. So have a motion and a second, and we can move it into discussion. A little bit of outside noise right now, so if folks on the phone are having trouble hearing, just let us know.
Yeah, it might be helpful if Dave could, I think it sounded fine, but if you could just repeat it one more time.
So my attempt was something along the lines of that the SAB supports the use of EPA's approach of using the geometric mean to represent PFOA and PFOS BAFs for North Carolina. Something, we could wordsmith it a little bit, but that's pretty close.
That sounds good to me. That sounds good to me. Thanks.
The only thing I'll add to the discussion is we need to be sure what EPA's approach is for geometric mean, because in the two criteria documents, they used a geometric mean when they had data for the same species to represent one data point for that species in a distribution among species. And then they pulled the 20th percentile of a species sensitivity distribution to calculate a level in fish that would be equivalent to a water concentration. So they didn't use they used central tendency when they had more than one value. When they were looking at all the values, they looked at a 20th percentile. And the reason that's protective is because they had a different endpoint. They were trying to predict the level in fish working backwards from a water concentration instead of the direction that we're going. So defaulting to EPA would be, is good, but you have to be clear that that's in fact what they would do or typically recommend is always the geo mean as the measure of central tendency across taxa as opposed to within a taxa.
Well, maybe we should table that until we get a chance to actually explore that and then bring that to the next board meeting. So I'll withdraw my motion.
Okay.
And you can withdraw your second.
I don't think he has to. My second. Yeah, I think it would be good to maybe just look at different approaches and also this business with a trophic level, just to get a clearer understanding what these numbers would look like and what it would translate into.
So 2 requests of information, and we have made progress since last time, because since last time we've learned that adding all of the data versus just the North Carolina data doesn't really affect those measures of central tendency much, and have moved on, which was part of number 2. But now that we're at number 3, there's a request to move it more toward the phrasing of like number 2, a scientifically sound, a deference to established practices from EPA, and learn what those are to see if that would be an approach that works for the state and works for us. Along the way, examine whether or not there is a trophic level relationship amongst the data when you look at it across that whole data set as opposed to a site-specific data set. And visit it at the next meeting, and maybe if we get that homework done over the next few weeks or so, it can be things that are sent out in advance to prime a discussion or decision as opposed to having to refresh everybody's memory again. One other thing that I would be interested in is whether or not, there's any flexibility or thought about a range of values around the other factors in this equation. Surface water concentration that's protective of people eating the fish with a reference dose, a relative source contribution, a body weight, and a fish ingestion rate. And we're talking about the variability in one of those but without the variability in the others. Is that anything that y'all have thought about? That there could be a range of values for any of those parameters?
I think what gets tricky is in having a range is implementing that range in water quality protection programs. So we would typically default to the most protective value.
But you wouldn't necessarily get to the most protective value body weight wise if we're using an average only. It would be, unless you open it up, say, well, we're going to look at a high body weight and a low body weight and a high food ingestion rate and a low food ingestion rate and a high and low relative source contribution and what's the range of the RFDs. So I don't know if there's enough there to worry about, but I guess I would worry a little bit about obsessing about the variability in a BAF when those other parameters are fixed.
Yeah, I mean, to not use the parameters that are in the rule gets us away from the rule, which just makes it more challenging. We could certainly present something to the EMC that wasn't derived per the rule, but just adds another layer of complexity. A scientific argument for why that's permanent.
How often is this done? For highly bioaccumulative chemicals, the only time it would make sense that you derive a surface water quality standard based on safe levels in fish as opposed to like a cyanide water quality standard where it doesn't matter and we would need to do it.
I'm not sure I was following you, sorry.
Like the only reason you would have a surface water concentration that was protective of fish tissue would be for highly bioaccumulative compounds. I don't remember that being done before. How often does this issue come up, and has the equation ever been commented on by somebody as all being fixed parameters?
Yes. So most of the standards that we currently have that are for fish consumption and for water supply too are from things like legacy compounds, kind of like pesticides and things like that, which traditionally kind of were bioaccumulative to some extent. The question of have people questioned our fixed exposure factor values? Yeah, all the time. There's arguments made that they shouldn't be fixed because of the compounding conservatism that's built into them. And that EPA uses kind of like the 95th percentile for the drinking water, 90th percentile for fish consumption, etc. Average for body weight. That there's some conservativeness built into that, and then plus when you add on the fact that we're using like a reference dose, which is typically kind of starting with a safe level of consumption. There's arguments that the method should be shifted to more of a probabilistic risk approach.
Sure.
But the way the traditional approach, the way that we have it in rule, the way that EPA supports at the time is the way it is right now. So that's kind of what we use.
Yeah. So I guess that just reinforces maybe the value of running this issue to ground about if we're given deference to EPA's percentile on body weight and ingestion rate, what would be their approach equivalent for this as a sound approach? Okay. Anything else anybody wants for more information as a basis for revisiting the final charge question? Great. Well, I think we're really close to wrapping that one up then. I'll ask though for the EQ and DHHS, is that path forward acceptable for y'all's planning processes, timelines?
Between meetings, find the answers to some of these questions. I think it's service a lot.
Okay.
We could do homework in between meetings, like if there's something to look at.
Yeah. I bet we'll have an answer on that trophic level, and I bet we'll have an answer on BAFs to share and do some mutual education before we regroup. Great. Well, that's pretty good progress. We closed out more definitively number 1 and 2 and have a clear path forward for number 3. That is the last of the business items in terms of new business. We have 2 more updates. And I think Franny's doing both of those that remain. But call up my agenda here. Dylan can do the same for anybody looking online. So the water and fish collection update, Franny's going to do, and then we'll hear about the consent order studies also from Franny. And sometime in this or near the close, maybe walk us through how you envision folding in Cape Fear River bioaccumulation factors that you'll be able to calculate. You don't have them available statewide, that part's easy, but when you do get additional data, the division is required.
All right, so in December, I gave a brief synopsis of the analysis that I had done at the time for Site 10 in this project, and I'll show the map in a second. But this is all of the data that I have analyzed so far. So just a quick overview. We started the study because we know PFAS are persistent in the environment. We have the Camorras facility that is contaminating the river, and that river serves as a drinking water source for North Carolina residents. The goal of our project was to examine the extent of contamination to better understand bioaccumulation of PFAS, and then to collect fish tissue data for the development of fish consumption. As far as the methods of this project, in the summer of 2022, we collected over 250 individual fish across 14 different species from the Cape Fear River below the Camorras facility all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And these species were targeted based on those frequently caught and consumed in the Cape Fear region, and those were surveys done by the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission. The fish fillets were analyzed alongside water samples collected in situ for 56 different PFAS, and this was done to support bioaccumulation factor calculations across trophic levels in North Carolina, to support DEQ standards development, and to support DHHS's development of PFAS-specific fish consumption advisories. The project partners, I know I've shown this slide before, but it is worth mentioning. This project was a huge effort and a big collaboration between 3 state departments, agencies, DEQ, DHHS, and the Wildlife Resource Commission. This is a map of our collection locations, and so we divided the Cape Fear River into 20-kilometer sections. Site 10, which is right at the Camorras property boundary, is that section right below Lock and Dam number 3, and then the sites are numbered going southward to the Atlantic Ocean because that's the way the river kilometers are numbered. And then we also have a reference site, which is not a particularly pristine or clean site, but it is spatially distinct from our 10 river locations. It is tucked up right next to Fayetteville, right at the Fayetteville boat ramp, and right near the Fayetteville Regional Airport. At our freshwater sites, which were Site 4, up through the reference site, we collected these 8 species of fish. The first 5, which are largemouth bass, channel catfish, flathead catfish, red ear sunfish, and bluegill sunfish, were collected at all sites. The reference site had a slightly smaller subset just based on the location. And then the other 3 species, the American shad, striped bass, and channel catfish, were collected opportunistically because they're not present at all of the sites. The marine sites, which are sites 1 through 3, were the locations we collected these 6 species of fish. These are striped bass, speckled trout, southern flounder, red drum, black drum, and sheep's head. The collection and processing was a huge effort that took a lot of people. It was a whirlwind of summer, including a lot of electrofishing. The Department of Marine Fisheries did a lot of hook and line fishing to collect sheep's head. They also used their routine monitoring operations, which are gill netting in the lower Cape Fear, to collect a lot of their specimens. We then processed them in the lab and had them sent to gel laboratories in South Carolina for PFAS analysis. What I'm showing you now, I'm going to orient you because all of the charts look this way. Previously, I showed you the surface water bar graph and then the bar graphs for the 6 species of that site. And I think that worked really well for one site, but since I'm presenting 8 sites worth of data, I'm presenting it this way for every species, starting at the reference site, which is the northernmost site, and then site 10 is right below Comores, and then going southward with the decreasing numbers. So everything is presented in terms of north to south along the Cape Fear River. To look at the data, these are surface water concentrations. These are nanograms per liter or parts per trillion. And if you just step back and look at the color scheme across the page, you can see that there are many of the sites that have the same colors present. And then the reference site, which is the northernmost site, has a slightly different pattern. So if you take a look at the first bar, that is PFMOAA. It's that light teal one right at the top. You can see my mouse. And so there's very little PFMOAA present at the reference site, which is above Lock and Dam 3. It's above the water intake for the Comores plant. And then after the Lock and Dam 3, you can see that PFMOAA is present at all of the sites, really in a decreasing pattern away from Comores. These are mean concentrations, so they're, for half the sites it is just one surface water sample, and then for 3 of them there is more than one, because they were collected alongside the fish, and some sites took more than 1 day to collect the fish we needed. The next compound is PFPRA, and so that's present in low concentrations at the reference site, and then in different concentrations across the study sites. There are some Comores compounds present at the reference site, and it's worth noting that the reference site is in the path of air deposition from the facility, so it is not expected to be pristine of these Comores or consent order compounds, but it is spatially distinct, and so we were looking at it as a basis of comparison, what's upriver and what's downstream from Comores. The third one, PFISA BP4, that's naphthalene byproduct 4. That's a Comores compound. It's present in the reference site and at all other sites. It's interesting that a little further down, there's PFOS is of course present in the water, but the PFO2HXA is a consent order compound, also a toxicity paragraph 14 compound, so there's going to be tox studies done on this one. Not present in real concentrations at the reference site along with Gen X and PMPA, but those are present in the water downstream. It's an interesting set of patterns. It, I think, shows not so much what is possible to be emitted from Comores, but what is downstream and perhaps in the effluent or still existing in the water due to water solubility or concentration gradients. But the study sites are not statistically different from each other. I will mention this very last one at the bottom, PFO5DA, it's a Comores compound, and it was present at 2 sites in the water. So now I'll just take you through the different species we looked at. The largemouth bass is the first species, and so there's a subset of compounds present in these fish that some of them were not in the surface water and some of them were. But you can look across these sites and see that all of the same colors are represented more or less at all sites, and that even at the reference site, PFOS is present in these fish. None of these sites were statistically different from each other. I think it's worth noting that PFMOAA was present in largemouth bass at site 5, just one fish, but it was detected. And the next species is the bluebill sunfish, and so this set of graphs does not look so different than the largemouth bass. A lot of the same colors are represented. A lot of the same PFAS were found in these fish as in the largemouth bass. The PFOS concentrations are a little different, a little lower, but it is still present at all of these sites. And again, no statistical differences in any of these. The blue catfish is different in that it had very low concentrations, and so the next slide is kind of a zoom in on the very short end of this scale. So the scale goes up to 70, the scale goes up to 5 ppT. This is a very, very zoomed in look at this data. So the colors are fairly consistent across these sites. They're very low concentrations, and even the PFAS concentrations are all less than 3. The flathead catfish, so this is a regular scale up to 70 again. It's a similar pattern across all the sites. This particular species was not present at the reference site, so we don't have a reference site to compare the study sites to. But these study sites were not statistically different from each other. Pardon me. The red ear sunfish is the next species. This again, we did not have these at the reference site. So it's just the study sites we have to compare to each other. The same pattern, really, you can look and see all the same colors present in about the same proportion. What I think is interesting at site 8 is 6,2 FTS is present. So this is 6,2 fluorotelomere sulfonate. It's a aqueous film forming foam PFAS, so it's an AFFF foam. PFAS, and it's only present at site 8 in this species and one other. So it's interesting to note, but it did not drive a statistical difference. So the last 3 species I'm going to show you, we only have fish from 2 sites. And these are the ones that we were opportunistically collecting because they're not present at all sites. So the channel catfish was present at the reference site, and then again at site 5, so further down the river. Even with this large spatial difference between these 2 sites, the patterns are not so different. Further down the river, there's PFDA and PFDS in these fish, but in very low concentrations in their muscle tissue. The next species is striped bass, and so this is a slightly different subset of sites. These are present at site 8 and site 5, so not the reference site, but 2 of the study sites that are spatially distinct in the river. At site 8, again, we see this AFFF PFAS present in the fish tissue. But not any other site. Other than 6,2 FDS, the pattern is quite similar between these 2 sites. And then the last species is the American shad. So we do have the reference site and then site 10 for this. So it's just above Comores and then just below. I think this is interesting because the PFAS concentration and the other PFAS that were present at the reference site are all higher in detection than at site 10. There is a good chance this is due to the size of the fish that were collected at these 2 locations, which I'll get to in a second, but I thought this was just an interesting pattern. It was the opposite of what I would have expected. I feel like that can be said for a lot of the data that I've looked at. So I compared, based on this chart and a lot of the others, I compared the log PFAS concentration and the fork length, or size of the fish. And so fork length is measured from the tip of the fish's nose to their tail where there's a fork. And so the ends of the fins can be ripped off as they make their living in the environment. And so the fork length is a very good measure of size. Also, in most species, a solid estimate of age. The PFAS concentration is on the y-axis, the fork length is on the x-axis. And these are separated by the 5 species that we have represented at all sites. The light purple or periwinkle colored bar and line at the top of the graph is PFOS, so PFOS. And that is the line that the equation, or the R-squared value, it corresponds to. And then all of the other PFAS are listed on the side of the page in the key. And the shaded region is the standard error of the line. Looking across this data, it appears that there's not a relationship with PFAS concentration and size for most species, which in my experience is unusual. There usually is when size is an estimate of age. For the flathead catfish, the lines are trending upward, even though the R-squared value is quite low. Flathead catfish are an upper trophic level predator in this ecosystem, and they do eat all the other species of fish. When we presented this data for Site 10, there were only 5 dots on this line, and I thought that as we added more fish to this plot, this relationship would become more clear, but that is not what happened. It didn't become any more clear at all. And then for the blue catfish, the lines trend the opposite way. And so there appears to be an inverse relationship with size and PFAS concentration. That's indicative, I think, of their dietary shifts throughout their lifetime based on size. That is the steepest line and highest R-squared value at just 0.3. There are some PFAS here that are not represented across all size classes, and so some lines are shorter, but for the most part, they all kind of trend the same way within the same species. The next thing I did, looking at this, I wondered if the reason there was no relationship here was because we were collecting different size classes at different sites, and if we were collecting smaller fish at Site 10, which in theory could have been more contaminated. So this is a box plot that shows site along the bottom and fork length on the y-axis, separated by species. We show the distribution of fork length at each site for that species. The line is the median. The top and bottom of the box plot are the first and third quartile, and then the dots are outliers. Looking across the 8 sites for each species, there's variability, and it definitely changes per species, but it's easy to see that there's not a clear pattern of size across the sites, that's good news. We were hoping to collect animals of comparable size across all sites, and I thought this could be a confounding factor, but it doesn't appear that it is. We did catch bigger blue catfish at the reference site, and that could be why that line is so much steeper than the others. But the concentrations in those fish are also quite low, and so I don't think that had an impact on the shape of that line. I think it was the low concentration that drove that relationship. As far as the statistical analysis goes, and so this box plot is a different one. On the y-axis, there is PFOS concentration, so PFOS. And then you have surface water, and then the 5 species of fish separated by site. When I ran the generalized linear model, I used PFOS concentration because it was present in every fish that was collected, rather than using some that were not present at all. The statistical analysis showed that only species was a significant predictor of PFOS concentration. Site or distance from the point source, length, size, weight, proxies for age, were not related to PFOS concentration. That is unusual in my experience, and not what I expected, but that is what at least the preliminary analysis of this data has shown us. I calculated bioaccumulation factors for this data, and so it should be noted that you can only calculate a bioaccumulation factor when you have PFAS in the water and also in the fish. And so there are PFAS that are present in the water that are not in this table, and there are PFAS that are present in the fish that are also not in this table. This is just, it's only going to be calculated when you have both. And so there are a lot of numbers on this table, and the specific numbers indicate the magnitude of bioaccumulation. There are a few things that I think are noteworthy, and I'll point those out to you. The first column here is largemouth bass, and so the N is the number of fish. And so this larger number here in the header is the total number of largemouth bass we had in the study. And then the numbers presented alongside these PFAS are the numbers of fish these were detected in, just to give you a basis of understanding of how much confidence or how many fish these compounds were detected in. The largemouth bass was the only species where PFMOAA was detected. It was detected in one fish. And it does have a very low, the lowest bioaccumulation factor that was calculated for this study. I think this follows what the human biomonitoring study showed, that it accumulated more than they expected based on its low KOW value, but it did in fact accumulate with time and age and exposure. And so I think that is noteworthy. It has only been detected in one fish, and so I have plans to further investigate that, but I think that is worth mentioning. If you look in the third column, this is the red ear sunfish, so these are smaller fish. The PFOS, bioaccumulation factor, is about 1,200. If you follow this table down, this was the same species that PF05DA was in fact detected in. That number is almost identical to PFOS, and we know that PFOS is very bioaccumulative, more so than many other compounds. And so it's interesting, I think, that two of these consent order compounds, PFMOAA and PF05DA, are at opposite ends of the bioaccumulation factor spectrum in our study. I would not have predicted that. I would have assumed they would have accumulated in a similar fashion, just based on their size, shape, and the fact that they were designed as replacement. And most of these compounds were designed not to be bioaccumulative. Also worth noting, the red ear sunfish were the species that PFOA was detected in. There are 4 fish that PFOA was detected in and 4 fish that PF05DA was detected in. Those are not the same 4 fish. Those are 4 unique fish that detected each of those of note. And then a kind of across the board for PFOS, you can see that the bioaccumulation factors vary quite a bit. It's low in blue catfish and quite high in largemouth bass and bluegill sunfish. This is likely due to their diet and trophic position. You can see that just there are species-specific differences in these bioaccumulation factors that I think are worth noting. For this, I also should mention all 12 water samples throughout the Cape Fear River were used, the average of the PFAS concentration in those 12 samples, and then all of the fish that had these detections were used because there were no site-specific differences in the data. They were all pulled together to calculate these bioaccumulation factors. Okay. And then really what I want to mention is that these compounds that we found in very few fish, PFMOAA, PF05DA, PFBA, there's a number of them that were only detected in a few fish. The next thing that I'm planning to do is to take the liver of these fish and have them analyzed for the same suite of 56 PFAS, because I think that the detection limits could be part of the reason we are not seeing more of these site-specific compounds, and why a lot of them are just so low in concentration, because they'll accumulate more in the liver than they will in the muscle tissue. And so the liver, I think, could tell us a lot more about what is present in these fish. Perhaps not what is in their fillet, but how these compounds are bioaccumulating. So that is the next step as far as where I'm looking at this data from. To summarize this, I mean, we're going to use all of this data to the best of our ability to create standards. Of all the PFAS measured, PFOS, FOS, was the leading compound in these fish fillets, and this follows many other fish studies. The preliminary statistical analysis showed that species is the most important factor in predicting PFOS concentrations in fish fillets, and I think this is likely just linked to diet and trophic position. The next steps are to target those livers from those fish where there were only a few detections of different compounds, and then to process and analyze the marine species from sites 1, 2, and 3. Those have not been processed or analyzed yet. But those are the next steps for this project. I've shown this to you before. This is just our timeline. Right now, we're in the data review and analysis process, and we're hoping to use this for regulatory and health applications. publications this year. That's it. And the more that I look at this data, the more that I am confused about it. And so any suggestions you have for analysis, or ways I could slice and dice the data to see if there's a relationship that I'm not seeing, I am very interested in your recommendations. I expected there to be relationships with some of the things that there usually are for environmental toxicology, and there just are not. So I'll take any questions or comments or recommendations you have.
Thank you, Franny, for the overview. If you haven't read it lately, that Burkhardt paper that summarized EPA's bioaccumulation factors, my take on it was only for PFOA and PFOS, but that they didn't see some of the trends that you were looking for, which is one of the reasons that they were lumping data the way that they did. But might want to read that and see, refresh your memory and I'll refresh mine about what they tested, what relationships they tested for and didn't see in a much bigger data set that had some more strength to it.
I haven't read that paper in a while either.
And, compared to other legacy compounds that you mentioned that were real fat soluble, this one's not. So, these aren't. So maybe they behave differently in that regard to still affected by trophic level and diet and things like that, but maybe in a different way. Any questions or comments for Franny before they continue to do data analysis?
Comment.
Sure.
The liver data will just confuse you more. No, honestly, at the end, you might want to ask what would be, is there value added in running the liver data and how will it actually inform generation of standards? And, there could be an academic exercise in which you would like to pursue looking at liver, but I'm not sure that the value added for liver is going to be as great as you might think it would be.
Based on everything else with this project, I feel like that might be the case as well. What I was initially planning to do with the 3 marine sites, because there are distinct species from these others, was to pair their liver and muscle tissues together.
Sure.
And so before I send those 70 livers to the lab, I think choosing a subset of this data set could tell us more, perhaps, but could also just show us whether or not running all of those livers has distinct value.
Or pick like 2 species, like for example, the sunfish and blue catfish, because they're behaving differently with respect to their muscle concentrations. Just, start there, see what the data looks like, and then ask yourself what questions have you actually been able to answer by looking at that liver data. That would be the 2 cents worth of advice I'd give you. If you try, what basically this data is telling me is it's variable within the species. It's variable somewhat by location, although statistically they look the same. And, the hypothesis that as the fish gets older and its fork length increases, and so concentrations would change, doesn't appear to be true for most of the species. You can answer that question.
I hadn't considered using the blue catfish versus one of these other species just based on the trends of their lines, but that's a good suggestion. I was thinking about targeting just the species that have these low detections of unique compounds, but I like that. I think.
So again, let's say you submit the livers and non-detects become low detects. 1, 2, 3 parts per trillion. Now what? In other words, if you had an analytical method that could go 1 per quadrillion, you'll find it. So chasing 0, are you trying to chase 0? Or are you trying to prove that, well, the fish have got each of these contaminants? That becomes an analytic question as opposed to a public health question. So that's where I would just ask, what's the value of coming back and saying, well, it's 1 part per trillion in liver. Okay. Now what? So how would you actually, what would you do? What would that information lead to with respect to decisions that you might make as an agency? And I doubt that it would have any impact.
So for the, go back. For the PFMOAA and the PFO5DA bioaccumulation factors, these detections in fish were very close to the detection limit of the instrument.
Sure.
And so hopefully by running their liver, we would get a higher concentration that would be not as close to the detection limit, so we would have more confidence in that measurement.
So you get 20. So, I mean, like, again, I would urge you to do it almost like a tabletop exercise. So the values are now slightly above the detection, the limit of detection for the analytical. Now what? What impact does that have? If you could fill the table in and say liver's at 30 or whatever it is, I mean.
Yeah. Since people aren't going to eat just the liver, then you
Right.
need something that builds back the muscle thing into fish, which adds additional uncertainty. So I get you.
Exactly.
Think about how you'd use the data besides, just detectability and proving that it's in different parts of the system. I was curious about the bottom of that table where you averaged across all the 12 water samples because they didn't differ. One thing that was in that Burkhead paper was that the lower the concentration tended to be the higher bioaccumulation factor. So even if they don't differ statistically, they might still be different enough to be an explanatory variable in your regression equation. And to me, that's the value of your data set, is that it is site-specific instead of borrowed from someplace else in the world. So I'd probably err on maximizing the information in each bioaccumulation factor and then average them at the end if you don't see a difference, rather than along the way collapsing differences that you don't see.
That's a good idea.
And your friends at WRC could probably let you test that regression with a 1 through 5 level on trophic level, and move that beyond species to trophic level.
That's a great suggestion too.
Just assign it a dummy variable of piscivore equals 5 or insectivore equals 1 and something else equals this, and then see if you get anything there. Yeah, it's a good data set. And another thing that would be interesting is to, for these species, fold it into the larger EPA data set that we saw earlier for where they would fall on the line of that distribution. If you have largemouth bass data from around the country, is this inside or outside that range? And that might inform the discussion about the things that we have here and don't have elsewhere. A representative was taking a median value from a national data set to represent North Carolina. The Cape Fear Basin is the only place that you'll be able to do that. But it would be an interesting graph to show somebody about the implications of using the other data set for data that you don't have statewide.
Well, all these values for PFOS, which is your richest data set, lives within that EPA range, because that's a huge range. I mean, it went from 3 to 52,000, so, okay. They're in the range, right?
Mm-hmm. It's actually very close to the geometric.
They are.
And that's the thing that
They're
I was
much closer to that.
And if you decide to use a geomean, like we were leaning toward, if that was EPA's processes, it would lend some comfort that you're not, missing much. You have to make that leap of faith for a water body that you don't have site-specific data for. Anything else on this one for Franny? Questions or comments?
Did you use the average value in each fish species and use that, or did you calculate it for each result so you can get some kind of uncertainty for each EAF value? So right now it's just a number. Is that one average divided by the fish average over the water average, or did you calculate one BAF value for each fish sample using the average water result?
This is the average fish over the average water. I didn't do the site-specific calculation, but I will. I think that can tell us more about.
Understanding the uncertainty in the numbers might be useful.
So part of our quality analysis was to do an uncertainty analysis on the data. Laboratory allows for certain compounds 30 to 50% variability based on whether or not there is a commercial standard for them or not. in their measurements. The uncertainty of these measurements was much, much lower than that. It was usually inside the 95% confidence interval of the sample concentration. And so they were using replicate data from a fish species where they spiked the tissue and then they spiked duplicate. And so that's where I did the uncertainty calculations from. So the numbers and the analytical quality of this data is very high, but I didn't calculate the uncertainty between the fish at one site to lead into this. And so I think that could be an interesting component of this as well.
But the other caution is that if I read your table right, for many of the sites, you only have a single water value. So the fact that statistically you're not seeing a difference from site to site is not surprising, given that you're relying on a single value for a number of the sites.
Yes.
So
Yes,
that's the other caution there, is that, saying, oh, well, they're all equivalent, that's, I mean,
So they were
it's
all
almost an
collected.
artifact of the way that you've got your data.
Yeah, they're collected at different times over the summer that paired with the fish. But we have historic surface water measurements from different places along the Cape Fear River, just based on our investigation of the Camorras facility. And so right now, the analytical chemist in the Waste Management Division is looking at the GPS locations to pinpoint them to sites in our fish study to see how the water concentration has changed over time, or if it does.
But what might be more relevant, getting back to variability, is to actually look, I mean, some of these are longer lived fish, right? So I mean, fish can live for a number of years. So it may be more relevant to look at the analysis, looking at what the range of values of that is within those 10-kilometer, 20-kilometer blocks that you've got. So not relying on that one temporal measurement that's done at that site, but instead ask, how variable was it at the Camorra site over the last year, say, or 2 years of sampling? That might give you a better idea of the uncertainty.
I think using, and like CFPUA and Brunswick County, they collect a lot of water data, and also Fayetteville Public Utilities. And I agree, I think in the river, with the high variability in flow, a grab sample could be just about anything.
Right.
But using a 1 or 2 year data set, get a representative water value, I think, would be better than averaging the 12 water samples.
I think that the way that the bioaccumulation factor concentration or equation was designed was for general use, not necessarily downstream from a chemical plant that is changing the concentration at the site based on their effluent.
The PFOS really doesn't change a lot between Fayetteville and Wilmington. I think pooling, and it's a pretty rich data set that's available, and I think for the non-Camorras compounds, that's fine. For PFMOAA, it's a little bit different story, but even then, Wilmington, I think, and Brunswick County have pretty good data sets for PFMOAA. But yeah, you were showing earlier, like PFMOAA might, right at Lock and Dam 3, the levels are definitely higher for PFMOAA.
They are.
But I think the rest of the data, I don't know how much of the variability is explained by flow in the river versus just a change in concentration over time. I think river flow between Fayetteville and Wilmington doesn't change a whole lot. I think there are major tributaries between Lock and Dam 1 and Lock and Dam 3. I think the flow rate is pretty similar in that stretch of the river. Not a lot of dilution.
From everything I've read, it's driven in part by what's allowed to escape from Jordan Lake. That when you look at, that those changes in what's going out into the haw is what's driving what's downstream even as far away as Wilmington. So there's,
Yeah.
looking at those flow rates going out of the haw, those vary quite a bit depending upon the weather. Here.
We saw the same,
All right, I'm going to draw this one to a close so that we can move on to the last presentation and update on the consent order studies so that we can try to end on time and let folks get back to other things that they have devoted their times away from to be with us today.
So again, I'll just give an update from the one I provided in December about the consent order toxicity studies and where they all ended in terms of timelines. Just for a refresher, the consent order paragraph 14 includes these 5 PFAS. The consent order requires that 28-day and 90-day rodent toxicities are conducted for rats and mice, and then the ecological toxicity studies are conducted for algae, both acute and chronic Daphnia studies, fish and sediment worm toxicity tests as well. This is the slide from the December meeting, and so this timeline is getting a little crowded, but the last update I gave was that we received the revised aquatic toxicology protocols for Daphnia and the sediment worms on the 1st of November, and we were preparing a response in early December. Since then, we have conditionally approved those 3 protocols just based on the confirmation of a few items. I just wanted to make sure that the things that were suggested in the protocols were true. And so I'm just waiting for a response on those items. And if we get positive confirmation that the suggested items are in fact reality, then they'll be approved. And they'll move on to the range finding tests for those. As far as the rodent toxicity protocols go, in December we had just gotten the immunotox 28-day rat and mouse revised protocols, and I had not yet reviewed them the first week of December. Since then, I have reviewed them. We had a meeting with Chemours and the contract laboratory, which is Charles River, on January 27th, so just 2 weeks ago. It was a really productive meeting, and I think that we got a lot of our concerns and questions answered. Currently, I am waiting on a revised protocol based on our meeting. So this is another slide that I showed before. And so these are all 5 of the aquatic toxicity studies. This is a slide from December, and so we had the algae and fish were previously approved, and the other 3 we were preparing a response to the revision we received. Currently, those 3 have been conditionally approved, and I'm just waiting on positive confirmation that the water changes and some other things are going to happen as they should. We also have gotten the range finding results for the algae toxicity tests. So I've received these range finding results for all 5 of those PFAS compounds that are included in paragraph 14 of the consent order, and I reviewed them with the toxicologists in the aquatic toxicology branch, as well as our algae group in the water sciences section. Together we came up with some items we have questions about, and so the onus is on me to reach out to Chemours toxicologists and get those answers to the questions so I can properly evaluate their data. That is the status of that currently. As far as the rodent protocols go, in December, this was the status. So we had just received the 28-day immunotox revised protocols, and we had not received the 90-day classic toxicology protocols for rat and mouse. Currently, we did receive those revisions, and an additional revision is required. The meeting we had 2 weeks ago was very productive. The main concern that I had about the mouse protocols has been addressed, and it will either, the appropriate method will either be done at the facility that Chemours wanted to use, and they will validate that method, or it will be done at a different location. But they will be using the newer, more appropriate ELISA assay for that specific test that I was concerned about. As far as the timeline moving forward, currently, I'm waiting for a revision based on our meeting. And then we are currently receiving timelines, work plans, and range finding results for the approved aquatic toxicology protocols. This is an active discussion with Chemours, and so I'm in the process of communicating with their toxicologist about the questions I had. My hope and goal is that still in early 2023, we will receive and review the 90-day revision to the 90-day rodent protocols. And this will probably require a meeting with Chemours in the third-party lab again. It is a really productive way to answer a lot of questions and address a lot of our concerns with the people that are actually going to be doing the studies. And so those are really productive meetings. And then we will submit questions and comments to Chemours and then hopefully approve these protocols before the summer. I think that it's really important that this work moves forward, and it's, the consent order is a big document, and there have been a lot of pieces of it moving for a long time. And I think that the toxicology protocols are a very important piece of it. And so I'm looking forward to getting this work started. But yeah, that's it. So I can take questions if anyone has any.
Great, thanks for the update. Are there questions or comments from folks in the room or any of the folks that are joining us online for Franny's update on the consent order studies?
This is Elena. I have a question.
Go ahead, please.
I'm guessing that tolerability studies and dose range finding studies are part of those are a part of those 90-day rodent protocols. They just aren't specifically called out. Am I correct in that? And then the other question is, if not, how will you determine doses?
Yes, you are correct. That is part. They are required to do range finding studies for all of these protocols.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the question, Elena. Other questions from folks in the room or on the phone? Comments?
A very quick one.
Sure.
Are these protocols for all of the compounds that are in the consent order, the table 3, or are they for the priority list? Neither. Okay.
I can go back to it, and I forget if is it attachment C or attachment B. It's these 5 that are required to have toxicity studies done. It's a subset of the entire group that is in the consent order. I don't have the reason that was done this way. I was not here.
Fortunate.
But I think that it's noteworthy that PFMOAA is one of them, and then PMPA, PEPA, and PFO2HXA are 3 that there are no commercial standards available for still.
Right.
And so the only avenue we have of getting this toxicity data is from Chemours. And the Nafion byproduct 2 is one that there is a commercial standard for, and there is some published data for, and so it is one that I think is a great method of comparison to the studies they're going to do to what is already existing in the literature.
Chemours will provide enough PMPA, PEPA, and PFO2HXA to conduct these studies?
For the contract laboratories, yes, they are required to.
Can you click down a couple of slides to the one that had all the stuff? Yeah, that one will work, I suppose. Get back one. In terms of all the different, yeah, that's probably good. To the extent that you all prioritize your own time or get the attention of attorneys and contract labs and others, I think the focus on the rodent studies are the ones that seem like they make the most sense for your path forward of trying to focus on the compounds that are detected and get a reference dose that would be human protective. The ecotox studies will be interesting. It'll surprise me if they drive any environmental regulation aimed at human health protection, which would mean if wildlife was somehow more sensitive than humans based on trophic level or behavior of the compounds. And you do get surprised in environmental data sets, but your own fish tissue data shows that PFAS is a little bit different than the rest of these in terms of bioaccumulation, and unless the compound is highly bioaccumulative, all those ecotox studies will be interesting, but not a driver. You might already know that, but in case it helps, when folks are really busy and think about all the stuff to do, working on those rodent studies, you get one good rodent study, and your system just cranks, and RFDs can get calculated, and environmental protection values for surface water, groundwater, fish tissue can all flow from that.
I agree.
All of the rest of that stuff can take a lot of time and energy and yield interesting results, but maybe not interesting results for management.
I agree. And I agree that the rodent studies are the most important, related to human health, related to our standards development. And I am not the reason they've taken this long. These protocols are 100% my first priority when they come into my inbox, which is why the fish data has not been analyzed as in depth as I would like to be. We waited 9 months for a revision that I believe was insufficient and unacceptable. And the meeting, I made that quite clear, and we are getting a revision once again. And so I'm emailing to ask for a timeline on that, but I am not the reason that these have taken so long. I am subject to the things that are sent to me, and the aquatic toxicology protocols were sent first. Can't say why, I don't know, but I think that the data that comes from the immunotox experiments will be more informative in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it wasn't meant as a criticism. You're one part of a team,
no.
and the team has people that include attorneys, managers. They can decide what levers to push or revisit as well. The overall strategy of defaulting to EPA for compounds for which they're going to drive is smart. Leave some data gaps for North Carolina. You got a way to get them. It helps somebody to say, work on this and not that. Besides you, who gets it? That's the intent that it was offered.
I didn't take it as a criticism. I just wanted to say.
Anybody else? Comments, questions?
Another quick one, but are there parallel efforts by NTP or other entities to fill in the gaps for some of the other fluor ethers like PFO5, PFO4, these other compounds that people have a lot of questions about?
So I don't know how much of this I should say publicly because they have not made it public. But I met with the National Toxicology Program about a year ago about just that these compounds that are commercially available, we still have few data for, and that, I petitioned them to conduct a mixtures toxicology study on a lot of these that are present in drinking water, and they were very receptive. Currently, they're doing a mixtures toxicology study for the legacy PFAS that they have individual rodent data for already. And I think that's a great way to begin to be able to compare individual toxicity and compound doses with this mixture before they start with these new compounds that nothing has been published for. Really. Whether or not that is going to come to fruition, I don't know. It was received very well, and I know they are, like many government agencies, at the will of those that provide funding. And so I think that it has been, I made it very clear how important it was, and I know that they agree. And so I think that if it is possible for those studies to be done, they will be. I think that there are other avenues for getting some of this data as well, including just academic labs. I've talked to a few different academic labs at some of the conferences I've gone to, and they're very interested in using some of these compounds. They're just not present in other states, so they don't know a lot about them. But I think there are many avenues to getting this data.
Including the read across with some in vitro methods. Go from one to another. Thank you for the presentation, and I'll check and see if we had anybody who signed up for the public forum since I asked earlier.
I did not, but would love if there's a minute to make a comment.
If there's 2 minutes, yeah, sure.
My name's Grady McCauley. I'm with the North Carolina Conservation Network, and I appreciate the chance to speak briefly. I'll say, so my background is law, which makes me particularly grateful for your all scientific expertise on staff and on the board, and for putting it to the service of the state. I want to make 3 brief comments. 1, 2 on the PFMOA discussion this morning. I appreciate that you all did not pursue the preliminary or provisional peer-reviewed toxic value. As a practical matter, as an advocate who wants to see environment and public health protected, that program, if it would give you a remediation target, in the absence of a value, the target is a practical quantitation limit. So we don't see a particular benefit to a value that's just a remediation value. In terms of the what you do with the study, I appreciate your analysis of whether you can act on the 2 studies that are there. I want to suggest for the long term that one policy consideration to keep in mind is where the incentive to do generate additional information and strong scientific information lies. If there is no reference dose and there's no standard, then it's really up to academia and the state that doesn't have a budget for it to do the analysis of where that number should actually be. If you have a reference dose and the state can generate standards and dischargers think that it's too stringent, they can fund the research to show that it's too stringent and raise the standard, relax the standard. So I do think that's an important policy consideration when you think about moving forward with the reference dose or not ultimately. And the last comment I want to make is on the bioaccumulation factors for the fish. I think if this body comes back to the EMC with one number, like the geometric mean, I think it is very much a policy question. What does it mean for water to be fishable? I mean, that's, with the water quality standards, that's in essence what the water quality standard is supposed to do for this category of waters. What does it mean for it to be fishable? That's a policy question. From watching the EMC for years, I think if you come back with one number like the geometric mean, they will see that as a scientific statement that that is protected. If you come back with a range, that particularly, and if you can articulate what the policy choice is that fits the ends of the range, I think that helps clarify for the EMC members that it is their decision, but that it isn't that there's one scientific answer, but that it's a policy choice that they have to make. So thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. All right, and continuing that, thanks to Paula for arranging lunches, to Dylan for facilitating this meeting on short notice. You did a great job, I appreciate it. To India, who was in here earlier, helping things get set up. To Franny for working on the agenda, including being responsive to my request that we spend some more time to reframe issues when we get back together. And to all of the board members who showed up, thank you, and those who joined online. My quick pivot from Mondays to Wednesdays, I know this one was a little bit aberrant. I appreciate people pitching in. The next meeting will be April 5th, and location TBD. We hear that I'll welcome any feedback on this venue and this location. Send me and Franny an email. We hear that the Archdale building's being retrofitted to be more AV interactive, and we'll just be back in touch. With that, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Yes.
Yay. Thanks, folks, for joining online. We'll see you in a couple of months.
Hi.
Aye.
You know,